What's up, everybody? This is Jason, and you're listening to the Unsung Podcast. What you're about to hear is part 7 of American Guerrillas, an ongoing series covering Bleeding Kansas, the Kansas-Missouri border war, and some other parts of the Transmississippi Civil War. I normally tell you to go back and listen to the previous episodes in the series if you haven't already, and I do still recommend that. There are references to previous episodes in this one, and I do still think it'll make more sense in context, but this one honestly does work decently well as a standalone. So, you're probably okay starting with this one, but if you do go that route, I hope it'll spark your interest enough to go back and listen to the whole series from the beginning. But before we get to this episode, this is going to be a little bit of a longer intro than usual, because I got a story of my own to tell you. If you don't care about my personal life and you want to skip it and get straight to the episode, I'll leave a timestamp in the show notes that you can skip to. See, it's been quite a year for my family and I. If you follow me on Substack and see the notes I post there, you might know what I'm about to talk about. But for anyone who doesn't know, my wife and daughter and I live out here in rural central Oklahoma. Or at least we did until March 14th of this year. Not quite the Ides of March, but close enough. March 14th was a Friday, and I had left that morning with a couple guys from church to go to a weekend men's retreat out in western Kansas near Hays, about 5 hours drive from where we live. There was also some crazy weather forecasted for that day on the Great Plains, all the way from the Canadian border to the Rio Grande. For our area, that weather took the form of high winds. We're talking about up to 50 miles an hour sustained, with gusts sometimes 75 miles an hour or more. For reference, those are tropical storm-level winds, except they're happening on the plains instead of out at sea. Some areas saw gusts up to 100 miles an hour, which is getting into Category 2 hurricane territory. These are winds strong enough to blow cars around and cause crashes on the highway. They're also strong enough to whip up raging prairie fires under the right conditions. And on March 14th of this year, we were under extreme fire danger conditions. Which is weird for March. Fire season around here is usually more in late July and August. But it was a pretty dry winter this year on the whole. The sad state of my farm pond can testify to that, and combine lots of dry prairie grass and underbrush with crazy high winds, and you get extreme wildfire conditions. So we knew there were extreme wildfire conditions that day, but we weren't too worried. We'd seen these kind of conditions before. Even had evacuation orders for wildfires in our area before. But we get maybe 2 or 3 hours into this 5-hour drive out to western Kansas, and I get a call from my wife. She says, "There's quite a bit of smoke around the house right now. I'm getting a little worried. Probably just being paranoid, though. What should I do?" So I check online for what fires are being reported. There doesn't seem to be anything in our immediate area at the moment, so I'm thinking the smoke my wife is seeing is blown from somewhere pretty far away, because that's pretty normal when wildfires are going on. So I tell her just keep an eye on the reports online, see how it's going. Maybe an hour or two later, I get another call from my wife. She says, "There's a lot of smoke in the air now. It's getting worse. I'm really worried now, probably still just being paranoid though." So I check the reports again. Now there is a fire reported pretty close to our house. No evacuation order for our area yet, but I tell her, "Yeah, get out and go to your mom's in Tulsa." I'm thinking we'll probably be okay, but we have a 1-year-old, so better safe than sorry. So she loaded up the baby and a few important things in the truck and took off to Tulsa, which turned out to be a good call because pretty soon after that, there was an evacuation order put out for our area. We got to Hays and ate dinner, and then I started getting calls from my neighbors saying, "Hey, the fire's in the field across the road. Hey, it got your chicken coop. Hey, your house is on fire. I'm trying to put it out." Both of my neighbors were over at my house trying to put the fire out because I have good neighbors, but they're not firefighters, and all they had to fight it with was buckets and a garden hose, which, as it turned out, was not going to cut it. All we have out here is a local volunteer fire department, and they had their hands full trying to get the prairie fire contained. As soon as we figured out what was going on, we hightailed it back from Hays, but we were 5 hours away. That was the longest 5-hour car ride of my life, and we got back around maybe 11:30 that night to find what looked like a mini apocalypse in my immediate neighborhood. The prairie fire had already come through. Everything was burned and blackened, trees and branches still on fire, some of them still standing, some fallen, some in the road. And in the middle of all that were the flaming ruins of my house, burned to the ground. It was just about done burning by the time we got there, with just some bits and pieces of things still on fire, heaps of ashes on the slab foundation, twisted sheet metal roofing and siding, some of it glowing red with the heat. So the bad news is, we lost our house to this wildfire, along with pretty nearly everything we had, except the few clothes and a couple books I had with me on the weekend trip, whatever stuff my wife was able to toss in the truck real quick before she got out, and the stuff in our little shed greenhouse, which actually didn't burn, weirdly enough. And of course, we lost our chickens when the coop went up, all except for one hen who somehow made it out and escaped the fire, no idea how. And we weren't the only ones either, by the way. There were several different wildfires that hit central Oklahoma that day and the next couple of days after, and I think I saw somewhere that something like 300 to 400 homes burnt to the ground in our wider region. The priest at our parish lives in western Stillwater, and there was a major fire over there that burnt like 40 homes just in his neighborhood, but his house came out all right, even though the fire came directly through his yard and burnt all the grass. The good news is that my wife and daughter were okay, since they got out before the fire hit us. We have 2 dogs, both of which were at the house but not inside the house when the fire hit, so they were out in the open, able to maneuver, and they both survived. And all our cattle survived too. For anyone who doesn't know, our house was on a 20-acre piece of land that we own, and we have a little herd of 4 Texas Longhorn cows out here, half Longhorn, half Angus bull, and 4 calves that were born right around the new year. And they all survived, and they're still doing well. The other good news is that we have real good insurance. I called our insurance company the next morning, Saturday, March 15th, and they already had an adjuster out to our place that afternoon. And actually, we had our check for the house and outbuildings almost within 2 weeks, and we got a really good deal. Still working on itemizing all the stuff inside the house. That'll take a while longer, but I have no doubt we'll get a good deal for that stuff too. American Farmers and Ranchers is our insurance company, in case you're wondering. Everybody I've talked to says they're the real cat's meow, and so far that seems to be pretty accurate. But there's even better news than that. People say that when you run up on hard times, especially something sudden and devastating and unexpected like this, you find out who your friends are. And let me tell you, that has held true for us. Even before we left Hays, when we first heard that my house was in imminent danger of being burned, we were getting ready to hightail it back, and I was freaking out a little bit. And one of the guys I was on the trip with said to me, "You have a big family here. Whatever happens, you don't have to go through it alone." And that wasn't just talk. It's proven to be very real. I mean, the response we've gotten from this, to call it generous would be an understatement. Our family, friends, and church have been incredibly generous, and not just our own parish, but the word has gotten out to other parishes in our diocese. And we heard from our priest that even Metropolitan Saba of the Antiochian Archdiocese of North America has heard about our family specifically. My employer at my day job has helped us out, and my coworkers too. Even the manager of the cigar bar in Stillwater, where we hang out on Sunday afternoons, held a surprise fundraiser for us. It's overwhelming how generous everybody has been. I feel like George Bailey at the end of It's a Wonderful Life, when all his friends are showering him with money to get him out of the financial trouble he's in. It's very comforting to not have to worry about money in the middle of all this. We have enough on our plate dealing with insurance and cleanup and rebuilding plans. Money is one less thing to worry about now, and it's because of the generosity of everyone around us that we're able to not worry about money. So we're incredibly grateful for that. And we do plan to rebuild. And that's another upside of all this. As soon as we get insurance and mortgage stuff straightened out, we'll be able to design a brand new house just the way we want it. I'll get to build the garage gym that we didn't really have room for in the old place, and my wife will get to design her own kitchen from the ground up. Until then, we're staying in Tulsa, and we have a stable enough living situation until we get our new house built. Of course, the obvious worst part of all of it is losing the stuff that can't be replaced. A lot of it can be replaced. Furniture, books, electronics, clothes. But a lot of it can't be. I had a wooden gun cabinet that I built myself in middle school shop class. Several of the guns I had in it were heirlooms. There were a couple pieces of furniture like a dresser and a big rolling wooden shelf thing that were made by my grandpa, who was a carpenter. My wife's wedding dress was in the closet, and my wedding suit was in there too. But the stuff I'm the most upset about losing is my books. Not because the books themselves can't be replaced, they can, but because my books can't be replaced. See, I like to mark up my books when I read them. I underline things, bracket things, make notes in the margins. Every time I finish a book, or sometimes a chapter or a section or something, if the particular book lends itself to this, I make a note on the table of contents page with the month and year that I finished it. I had probably a dozen notebooks at least filled up with notes on the books I read, including books I've read and am still reading for this podcast. All these things are like a roadmap of where I've been, and that's all gone now. This also means I lost all of my research notes for this podcast, except the few that were in the one book I had with me on the weekend trip, which therefore escaped the fire. So, of course, that's going to slow me down somewhat, since I'll have to work harder to refer back to information I've already been over. But at the end of the day, it's all just stuff. I'm grateful most of all that my wife and daughter were okay, and I'm grateful that we have such a great community around us. Now that that's out of the way, if you're not subscribed on Substack, you can do that at the link in the show notes. If you'd like to support the show, you can do that there for $5 a month or $50 a year and get access to some paid-only material. You can also make a one-time donation if you want to PayPal or Venmo. Those links are also in the show notes. Now, like I said at the end of Part 6, this episode is a little bit of a detour from the main storyline of the series, but it is very much related, and I will eventually tie it back into the main series. And when it's all said and done, I think you'll agree with my decision to include this detour. So with all that being said, this is American Guerrillas, Part 7. Let's go.
Why, you gonna pull those pistols or whistle Dixie? If I get to liking someone, they ain't around long.
I notice when you get to disliking someone, they ain't around for long either.
Pretty sure we have time to bury them fellas.
Hell with them fellas. Buzzards gotta eat, same as worms.
Once upon a time, not that long ago in a state not that far away, I visited a monastery. This was in the mountains of New Mexico. Not that far from the battlefield of Glorieta Pass, actually, for anyone familiar with the New Mexico campaign of 1862. It's a beautiful place. It's far away from any city lights, so it's one of those places where on a clear night you can look up in the sky and see more stars than you ever imagined were up there. And it's also peaceful. My spiritual father has said that the peace we get to experience at monasteries as laymen is a result of the unceasing spiritual warfare waged by the monks against the forces of hell. And monks are a special breed of man. As a rule, they're very serious people. Their rules and practices can vary from monastery to monastery, but they're generally not there to converse with visitors or be friends with you. They're there to fast and pray, live their monastic life, and ultimately to wage spiritual warfare. At this particular monastery, only a certain few of the monks had a blessing from the abbot to talk to us visitors at all. One of the monks who had such a blessing showed us that serious doesn't have to mean humorless. We were out cutting firewood one day, 7 of us from my church's group and 2 of the monks. We took a break from work and the monks got out some dried fruit for us as a snack. I didn't recognize the fruit, so I asked what they were, and one of the monks said, "These are figs, these are mangoes, and these are dates." And then after a slight pause, he said, "I haven't had a date in a while." Then he walked away without saying another word. So that was my little glimpse into monk humor. I wonder how many other visitors he's told that joke to, but I bet it's not 0. Anyway, why am I telling you about this? Well, It must have been the second or third day we were there. The monk in charge of taking care of visitors came up to the guest house to talk to our group for a bit. Dispensing spiritual wisdom and talking about church stuff. He got on the subject of orthodoxy in America. It's been on the rise in recent years. The church has seen a lot of new converts, myself included. He told us about a particular elder, and I can't for the life of me remember which elder it was. I apologize for that. It doesn't hugely matter, though. Anyway, someone had asked this elder if the United States as a nation would ever convert and become Orthodox like Greece or Russia. His answer was that, yes, it could. But before that could happen, he said, the nation would first have to seriously reckon with the genocide of the Native Americans. Now, in some circles, that could be considered a pretty politically charged thing to say. If you've been following this podcast at all, it's probably not all that hard for you to figure out where I come down on our wonderful American left-right political spectrum. And maybe this is a personal failing on my part, but the fact is that if I heard just about anyone else speak the phrase Native American genocide, I'd probably just write him off as a silly libtard and leave it at that. But in this case, I've just heard an Orthodox monk relay to me a statement from an Orthodox elder which includes that phrase, and that was enough to give me some pause. I know for certain that given who and what they are, neither of those men are anything like libtards. They're not exactly right-wing either. In fact, they really fall completely outside that dialectic. I've talked about those false dialectics in American politics before in this series, and this was a dialectic-busting moment for me. When it comes to that phrase, Native American genocide, you could talk about the definition of genocide and whether what happened to the Native Americans qualifies as that. You could talk about the history of the term genocide itself and how it was originally coined for political reasons and continues to be used for political purposes. You could quibble about all that stuff, but I suggest that you'd be missing something more important. The history of European colonization of the New World is long and insanely complicated, as is the expansion of the young United States across the North American continent throughout the 19th century. But whether you want to call it a genocide or not, what can't be questioned is that it involves immense human suffering throughout. The episode we're going to talk about in this episode is just one little piece of that immense suffering. It's an episode that is somewhat tangential to the main story of this series. It doesn't have a huge effect on the Civil War as a whole, or even on the guerrilla war in Missouri, although it does have some effect, and both Kansas and Missouri will be involved. But the reason I ultimately decided to cover it in this series is that, at the end of the day, it's a piece of the history of the region we've been talking about. It's a largely forgotten piece of that history, and it's a story that needs to be told. After all, I called this show the Unsung Podcast precisely because I intended to cover these kinds of forgotten stories. And when it comes to reckoning with the Native American genocide, as this elder put it, maybe a good place to start is by remembering. Not just the fact that a lot of people died from the time the colonies were established to now, but remembering the details and telling the story at the human level. So, we're going to talk a lot about Injuns in this episode, specifically about Indian Territory. The land bordering Kansas to the south is today known as the state of Oklahoma. Excluding the Panhandle, it was carved off from Arkansas Territory in 1834, shortly before Arkansas became a state in 1836, and from that time until Oklahoma became a state in 1907, it was known as Indian Territory. What happened there during the winter of 1861 to 62 was among the most brutal and harrowing things to ever happen to Indian tribes in America. And that's really saying something, because as we well know, that list is not exactly short. What's more, this particular event was perpetrated mostly by other Indians as a direct result of America's Civil War raging just across the border to the east in Missouri and Arkansas. In September 1861, after the Missouri raider John Matthews was killed in Kansas, the Lane men who killed him searched his body. Monahan writes in Civil War on the Western Border, quote, In Matthew's pocket, Lane's men found an order from Ben McCulloch to enroll the Quapaw Indians under the Confederate banner. So the South had stooped to winning the war with the scalping knife. The North screamed resentment. All but Jim Lane. He had been considering doing the same thing himself. End quote. But to tell this story, we'll need to go back. You knew I wasn't just going to tell you a story without any context, right? Because we're addicted to context here. Many of the tribes inhabiting the Indian Territory in 1861 were not native to Indian Territory. These tribes had already been on a long, arduous journey to get there a generation earlier. And it turns out that their involvement in the American Civil War has very little to do with the North-South divide in America, and everything to do with their own internal politics and divisions resulting from that journey. And to understand their involvement in the Civil War, and what happened that horrific first winter of the war, we'll need to follow them on that journey first. I'll preempt one potential concern right off the bat, which is to say that I'm not approaching this story from anything like a noble savage mythos. This story we're sometimes told about the natives living in perfect harmony with nature and each other until the Europeans showed up and started spreading disease and warfare is absurd on its face. I mean, people are people, and Indians are people just like everybody else. They're not some kind of peaceful, druidic nature spirits. So this isn't a story about European oppressors and Indian victims. What it is a story about the fortunes and chances of war, and especially about the unintended consequences of war. I referred to Thucydides on the Peloponnesian War in a previous episode, and now I'll do it again. This is from a time when the war had not broken out yet, but was threatening to, and there's a parley in Sparta between Spartan and Athenian envoys, and some of their allies. Thucydides puts the following in the mouth of the Athenian envoys speaking to the Spartans near the end of their speech. Quote, "Take time, then, in forming your resolution, as the matter is of great importance, and do not be persuaded by the opinions and complaints of others, and so bring trouble on yourselves, but consider the vast influence of accident in war before you are engaged in it. As it continues, it generally becomes an affair of chances from which neither of us is exempt, and whose event we must risk in the dark. It is a common mistake in going to war to begin at the wrong end, to act first and wait for disaster to discuss the matter. But we are not yet by any means so misguided, nor, as far as we can see, are you. Accordingly, while it is still open to us both to choose aright, we bid you not to dissolve the treaty or to break your oaths, but to have our differences settled by arbitration according to our agreement. Or else we take the gods who heard the oaths to witness, and if you begin hostilities, whatever line of action you choose, we will endeavor to defend ourselves against you." End quote. The thing is, these chances of war can affect not only the combatants, but also the peoples next to them, that bump up against them, who may or may not be all that interested in the issues that brought the war about in the first place. Do the Indians care whether Massachusetts or Virginia holds the hegemony over the United States? I kind of doubt it, except to the extent that it affects them. And of course, this struggle for dominance in the United States will spill over into the Indian Territory, otherwise I wouldn't be telling you this story. Now, there were a myriad of tribes in the Indian Territory in 1861, but the ones that figure most prominently in the Civil War are known collectively as the 5 civilized tribes, or sometimes the 5 civilized nations. And I actually think nations is the more appropriate term to use, for reasons I'll explain shortly. And the 5 nations we're talking about here are the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Muskogee, also known as the Creeks, and Seminole. Now, I'm going to refer to that 4th tribe mostly as the Muskogee, but if I call them the Creeks here and there, or if an author I'm quoting calls them the Creeks, just know Muskogee and Creek are 2 names for the same tribe. None of these tribes were native to the Indian Territory. They were all native to different parts of the American Southeast. The reason they became known as the 5 civilized tribes goes back to cultural changes that took place through their bumping up against Europeans. The Spanish and French, and as time went on, increasingly the British. Now, I really should start with a disclaimer here that I'm just going to barely scratch the surface of the history of these tribes and their dealings with Europeans. This could be a 12-episode series all on its own, but I'm really going to be depending heavily on one book in particular for my understanding of this stuff. It's a book called When the Wolf Came, The Civil War in Indian Territory, by Mary Jane Ward. According to her, the cultural changes among the 5 civilized tribes got started as early as the late 17th and early 18th centuries, going right back to the very beginning of British colonization. The largest and most powerful of the 5 tribes was originally the Cherokee. They had a pretty wide range, mostly inhabiting the Carolinas, Tennessee, and Georgia, but also parts of Virginia, West Virginia, Kentucky, and Alabama. To the south of the Cherokee lived the Muskogee, and parts of Alabama, Georgia, and northern Florida, and a little bit into Tennessee. To the west of them lived the Choctaw in Mississippi, Alabama, and Louisiana. The Choctaw overtook the Cherokee in population by the early 1800s. Then to the north of the Choctaw, you have the Chickasaw, living in northern Mississippi and Alabama, as well as western Tennessee and Kentucky. The smallest of the 5 tribes was the Seminole, who were originally part of the Muskogee Confederacy, but around the 18th century they moved further south into the Florida Peninsula, separated from the other Muskogees, and became their own tribe. Mary Jane Ward writes the following about the early dealings of these tribes with Europeans. Quote, Europeans entered what would be the southeastern United States in the early 1500s. First the Spanish, then the French, and later the British. As they did, warfare increased, and epidemics such as smallpox swept the tribes, greatly reducing Indian populations. So did trade between Indians and Europeans. British Indian commerce flourished when traders from the Carolina colony, founded in 1680, pushed deep into the southeastern Indian country. They offered European manufactured goods, firearms, brass kettles, knives, hatchets, beads, cloth, tools, and rum, in exchange for deerskins and slaves. Native people in the southeast became so dependent on the traders for these goods that over time they became commercial hunters, killing off herds of deer for their hides and competing with hunters from other tribes to pay growing debts to the traders. They also raided other tribes for captives that could be sold as slaves in New England markets or sent to West Indies plantations. In the early 1700s, the southeastern tribes rebelled against abuses and conditions growing out of colonial trade, but were unsuccessful in ending them. Surrounded by the British in Virginia, the Carolinas and Georgia, by the Spanish in Florida, and by the French in Louisiana, the southeastern Indians struggled to maintain their independence. Another consequence of colonial Indian trade was the appearance of mixed-blood children among the southeastern tribes. English, Scots, and Irish traders from the British colonies sometimes married or formed liaisons with Indian women. Their Anglo-Indian children would not have been welcome in the colonies. Among the southeastern Indians, however, a mother's children were accepted into her family, clan, town, and tribe. Anglo-Indian children often grew up learning the culture of both their parents, including English and their mother's language. Some learned to read and write and were exposed to Christianity. When they grew to adulthood, their skills in the English and Indian languages, literacy, and understanding of both cultures made them valuable to tribal leaders attempting to deal with Euro-Americans. Gradually, some moved into leadership positions in their nation and increasingly influenced its affairs. By the early 1800s, it was not unusual to encounter mixed-blood Cherokees named Van, Rogers, or Adair, Chickasaws named Colbert, Cheadle, or Love, Choctaws named Folsom, McCurtain, or Harkins, and Muskogees named McIntosh, Kennard, or Carr. When Protestant Christian missionaries began working among the southeastern tribes about 1800, some mixed-blood Indians, such as David Folsom, a Choctaw, supported their mission stations, which offered English education along with Christian teachings. End quote. It's easy to forget that by 1830, the southeastern tribes had already had 200 years or more of dealing with Europeans. And it's worth thinking about what these dealings looked like and how they could have been different. I used the term genocide earlier when referring to that elder, and I said it with full knowledge that a term like that can ruffle some feathers for people on my own side of the political spectrum. But there is a way this history could have gone down in which almost no one would object to the use of that term to describe it, and it's not that hard to imagine. For a pretty closely analogous situation, you could look at Julius Caesar's conquest of Gaul in the 1st century BC. Go read Caesar's own account of this. It's called the Gallic Wars, and it's riveting stuff. But these wars lasted about 8 years, and they were unapologetic, aggressive military actions on Caesar's part for the sake of conquest and glory. Now, the Romans were nowhere near as far ahead of the Gauls technologically as the Anglo-Americans were ahead of the Indians. But the key difference in my mind is not the technology, it's the cultural ethos underlying the conquering side. For the Romans, that ethos was pre-modern and pagan. For the Americans, it was Enlightenment and Protestant. That's important because the conqueror's attitude towards what they're doing actually affects how the conquest goes down in a big way. To give you an idea of what I mean, according to Caesar's own estimates, in the 8 years of the Gallic Wars, 1 million Gauls were killed and another million enslaved. And to further drive home this point, historians today think that the true number of dead Gauls was probably more like a few 100,000, and that Caesar actually exaggerated that number for his own political gain. Now, if that interpretation is correct, then what that means is that not only was Caesar totally unapologetic about this kind of mass killing, but also that he thought it would help him politically if he inflated the body count that he reported to the public, maybe even doubled or tripled it. Why would he think that? Simply put, it's because the cultural ethos of his society was much different from ours. The Roman public had nothing like the kind of moral compunctions modern Americans have about killing and enslaving foreigners for national glory and conquest. By the way, I'm not saying that Enlightenment-era Western countries have never done similar things. They have. What I'm saying is that we tend to have a different attitude about those things. With the spread of Christian doctrines like all men being made in the image of God and Enlightenment ideals like equality and human rights, people start to have different feelings about this ancient practice of conquest through warfare. The ancient ethos is maybe summed up best in another incident from ancient Rome, and forgive me for this tangent from a tangent, but I think it'll be illustrative. In 390 BC, about 3.5 centuries before Caesar's conquest of Gaul, long before Rome came into its own as a world power, an army of Gauls invaded Italy and attacked the city of Rome itself. They took most of the city. The remaining defenders were shut up in the citadel on the Capitoline Hill and besieged. To avoid their own destruction, the Romans parleyed with the Gallic leader named Brennus and negotiated a ransom for their city of 1,000 pounds of gold. To avoid a possibly long and costly siege, the Gauls would take the gold, go away, and give the Romans their city back. So the defenders came down out of the citadel, and somebody got out some scales to weigh out the 1,000 pounds of gold. You know, one of those balance scales where you put a known weight on one side and balance it with an equivalent weight of gold on the other side. Well, Brennus brought in his own steel weights to do the weighing, and as the weighing went on, some Romans started to complain that Brennus' weights were unfair. They were too heavy and would balance out more than the agreed 1,000 pounds of gold. When Brennus heard the complaining, he got angry, took out his sword and threw it on the scale, adding even more weight to be balanced out with Roman gold, and he exclaimed, "Vivictus," which translates in English to something like, "Woe to the vanquished." In other words, tough shit. We were stronger, you lost. That's the pagan, pre-modern attitude towards warfare and conquest in a nutshell. It's very much at odds with modern Enlightenment ideals of equality and human rights. And throughout Anglo-American interactions with Indians, you can see these two mindsets at war with each other in the minds of the American public. The dealings of the American government with Indians are often characterized as duplicitous or deceptive. The government will make certain promises and then instantly turn around and go back on them, or it'll say one thing and do another. And maybe that's a fair interpretation in a lot of cases. I mean, I would never be one to say the U.S. government has always been honest and above board with everything it's ever done. But I'm not so sure it's just duplicity either. Another way to interpret it might be as a manifestation of this conflict within the identity of America. Americans have always been a pioneer people, descendants of people who sailed across an ocean to settle a new continent. The concept of manifest destiny was on the rise in the mid-1800s, and although the concept wasn't explicitly named until the 1840s, it was percolating in the public consciousness for a long time before that. The fact was, Americans very early on came to see it as their national destiny to expand across the continent all the way to the Pacific Ocean. There were already Indians living all over the continent, and, well, if Americans had been ancient Romans, they would have thought nothing of just killing or enslaving them until they were subjugated. If anything, they'd have considered it a glorious national achievement to do something like that. But that's not who America was, at least not completely. There was also that newer, Enlightenment Protestant ethos competing for dominance in the American public mind. And so, in their dealings with Indians, you don't get explicit, unapologetic conquest and enslavement all the time, and you also don't get some kind of enlightened, egalitarian paradise with two peoples living in harmony alongside each other. What you get is what looks to me like not exactly a middle ground between the two, but more of a wild oscillation between brutal warfare between Indians and white settlers at some times and places, and relatively peaceful coexistence at other times and places. All that informs government policy towards the Indians, and the whole thing can start to look less purposefully deceptive and more schizophrenic at times. Not to say there wasn't also a lot of purposeful deception involved. And when peoples bump up against each other like this, and especially when they start to trade and intermarry, that's bound to cause changes in the cultures of one or both peoples. In cases like this, where the peoples are very far apart from each other, ethnically, culturally, and technologically, those changes can be pretty big. I mean, Europeans bumping up against Indians is quite a different thing from, let's say, Greeks bumping up against Thracians, right? Even technologies can have huge unforeseen impacts on culture. Look at something like the horse as a transportation technology. There were no horses in the New World until the Spanish got there in the 15th century. No Indians had any idea of what a horse was before the 15th century, but the Spanish brought horses over, and the next thing you know, Plains Indians were developing a whole new, fully nomadic culture based around chasing after buffalo herds on horseback. The reason the southeastern tribes became known by European colonists as the 5 civilized tribes is because of the cultural changes brought on by their interactions with Europeans. And by the 1820s, they were well down this path. They'd adopted things like written language and started printing their own newspapers. They'd adopted Anglo-American forms of government, complete with constitutions, bicameral legislatures, judicial branches, and executive councils. This is why I say nation seems like a more appropriate term than tribe. These really are becoming full-fledged European-style nation-states by the 1820s. They're very much not what we might think of as more quote-unquote traditional Indian tribes, like you see in Dances with Wolves or something. They're large, powerful, organized nations that can exert real influence not just on each other, but on the United States, too. The U.S. isn't yet anywhere near the powerhouse it will become in the 20th century, or even in the later 19th century. Here's Ward on the cultural state of the 5 civilized nations in the early 1800s. Quote, "By the 1820s and 1830s, white visitors to the southeastern Indian country of Tennessee, Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi might see much that was familiar. Housing ranged from log cabins to substantial brick or timber mansions. There were farms with livestock, crops, and orchards, sometimes worked by African slaves. General stores, cotton gins, blacksmith shops, ferries, toll roads, schools, and Christian churches. Indian women might have moccasins on their feet, but were usually wearing cloth dresses much like those of non-Indian neighbor women, except that they were neater, according to some observers. Those Indian women had probably carded the fiber and spun the thread they dyed and wove into the fabric they sewed for their clothing. Men might be wearing cloth shirts, trousers, and coats, or be dressed in leather leggings and turbans. Because by this time the southeastern tribes had adopted so many aspects of white culture, non-Indians were beginning to call them the 5 civilized tribes. In the mid-20th century, Cherokee Quapaw writer Lewis W. Ballard discussed this ability of Indians to take what they find useful from other cultures. By using them, he concluded, they make them Indian. End quote. Notice the mention of African slaves there. This is another thing that's kind of easy to forget, but lots of Indians owned slaves too, just like the whites. Throughout this process of incorporating aspects of Anglo-European civilization into their own cultures, guess what flavor of Anglo culture they were primarily incorporating? The Southern American kind, because that's who they were living next to. All 5 civilized tribes eventually adopted slavery, even though there were some mixed feelings about it. In fact, Ward even says that disagreement over how to handle runaway slaves was one of the issues that led to the splitting off of the Seminoles from the Muskogees. Now, whenever you have a culture incorporating foreign elements into itself, like the civilized tribes were doing, almost inevitably there are going to be internal disagreements over whether you should be doing that, or how much you should be doing that. And the 5 civilized tribes were no different. Ward continues, quote, "Not all the southeastern tribes accepted the new ways. For countless generations, rituals such as the green corn ceremony had united, revived, and renewed the southeastern Indian communities. At the urging of Christian missionaries, Indian converts abandoned ancient ways for new practices, activities, and attitudes. By doing so, according to the traditionalists, they were severing ties and endangering their whole tribal community. At the same time, mixed-blood Indians, who tended to be more individualistic and materialistic than those who were full-blood, seemed to be straying from the old ways that value generosity and sharing resources for the welfare of the entire community. One scholar has suggested that among the Cherokees at least, 3 categories of people developed: those whose goal was assimilation into the Anglo-American world, those who wanted to remain a separate people while adopting things such as literacy and Christianity, and those who wanted to maintain separation in traditional ways. At any rate, these differences of opinion and worldview exacerbated decisions about the great issues that were forced on the southeastern peoples in the 1820s, 1830s, and 1840s, and then again in 1861. End quote. Remember these kinds of divisions and splits within the Indian nations, because at the time the Civil War pops off, these tribes will have their own set of issues and concerns that have a lot to do with this stuff, and not much at all to do with the issues dividing the United States. Another growing concern for the southeastern Indians, especially as the 1820s rolled on, was, of course, the growth of the United States. We talked about manifest destiny a minute ago, referring to the idea that the destiny of the United States was to expand all the way across the North American continent to the Pacific Ocean. And while that term itself wasn't coined until the 1840s, the underlying idea had been around for a long time before that, at least as far back as the Louisiana Purchase of 1803. Well, expansion meant moving into Indian country, and the cultural changes in the tribes were driven in no small part by the arrival of more and more Anglo-American settlers to the southeast. With these kinds of changes going on, with the white settlers increasing demands for land to settle on, and with some factions within the tribes resistant to those changes, it was almost inevitable that conflict would break out, and it did. For our purposes, most notably in the Creek War of 1813 to 1814, also known as the Red Stick Rebellion. It takes its name from the traditionalist Red Stick faction within the Muskogee Nation, which, against the wishes of its own government, decided to follow the Shawnee chief Tecumseh in his appeal for an Indian alliance against white encroachment. Now, the story goes that Tecumseh went to some Creek chiefs, and in a council he gave them one of these great object lessons characteristic of stories about pre-modern peoples. He gathered up a bunch of red sticks and sat in front of these Creek chiefs, breaking the sticks one by one. After he'd broken a bunch of them, he then collected a bunch more sticks into a big handful and made a big show of trying to break that, which of course he couldn't, no matter how hard he tried. The lesson being, of course, that individually the Indian tribes were easily broken by the United States, but if they all banded together, they'd be unstoppable. And the Red Stick faction took its name from this little object lesson by Tecumseh. There's another book I've been drawing on for this period called Blood Moon by John Sedgwick, and I have a couple issues with this book, namely that Sedgwick seems to have pretty thoroughly imbibed the myth of the noble savage. To give an example, he actually says that greed and selfishness were introduced to the Cherokee as new emotions after contact with English traders and their capitalistic ways. I have a hard time believing that, but noble savage mythology aside, this book has helped me quite a bit to understand the deep history of the Cherokee especially and how their internal politics and conflicts led to the way their involvement in the Civil War played out. But as big as Tecumseh was on pan-Indian unity against the Anglo-Americans, he wasn't very successful at achieving it, at least not in the South. The Great Lakes region in the North was a different story, but in the South, the Red Stick Creeks were the only force of any significant size that rose up against the Americans during this particular period, and though they were large for a frontier force, they were still small compared to the kind of force that the U.S. government could muster, and they never had any real chance of stemming the tide of Anglo settlers. The fact was that at this time, the real Indian unity in the South was actually pro-United States, against the Red Sticks and against Tecumseh. We'll get into some reasons for that in a minute, but let's talk briefly about what became known as the Creek War, or the Red Stick Rebellion. Now, one thing I will give Sedgwick credit for is that noble savage stuff aside, he does not shy away at all from showing you the absolute brutality of Indian warfare on the frontier. I'll read you a passage about the opening act of the Creek War, and just know that this is not a unique passage in this book. There's a ton more like it where this came from. Sedgwick writes in Blood Moon, quote, "The following summer, in 1813, about 1,000 of these fearsome Red Sticks gathered in the woods outside Fort Mims, a thinly defended federal outpost just up the Gulf Coast from Mobile, Alabama, where a few hundred settlers had taken refuge. Imagining themselves well protected by a federal battalion behind a stockade fence, they soon grew casual about security precautions. Spying from the distant trees, the hostile Creeks noticed that the gates often stood open well after the noontime dinner drum sounded to draw everyone from the fields into the mess hall. This was the Red Sticks' chance. Their bodies slathered with the war paint of old, their faces colored ghoulishly, they surged several hundred strong across the field to pour through the open gate, filling the air with frenzied war cries. With a rain of bullets and arrows, they slaughtered soldiers and settlers alike, and then swarmed howling over the open fort and surrounding grounds, crazed for the tender flesh of any survivors. Men, women, children, it didn't matter. The Red Sticks hacked and hacked at them until the fort was silent except for the moans of the dying, the light scuffing of men in moccasins prowling for anyone left in hiding, and the wind. There had been 553 in the fort. 100 men, and the others women and children. Only 13 escaped the slaughter. When a federal investigator named Thomas Holmes arrived a few days afterward, the stinking, mangled corpses of all the rest made a grisly feast for buzzards and stray dogs. Indians, Negroes, white men, women, and children lay in one promiscuous ruin, he reported. All were scalped, and the females of every age were butchered in a manner which neither decency nor language will permit me to describe. The fetuses of the pregnant women had been hacked from the womb and dropped on the bare, blood-drenched chests of the mothers. The main building was burned to ashes, which were filled with bones, Holmes concluded. The plains and woods around were covered with dead bodies." End quote. This attack was unique only for its scale, but not for its brutality. There were similarly brutal attacks happening on the frontier all the time since even before the Revolution, including at least a few credible stories of cannibalism committed by Indians, by the way. But the federal government couldn't ignore the killing of over 500 settlers in a single attack, and the guy they sent to deal with it, you might have heard of, future President Andrew Jackson. Jackson put down the Red Stick Rebellion with an army of Tennessee militia, as well as contingents from all the civilized tribes except the Seminoles, including the Creeks. The Red Sticks were Creeks, and Jackson had other Creeks fighting for him against the Red Sticks. The famous frontiersman Davy Crockett was part of the Tennessee militia that fought in this war. I also have to mention here briefly that I have a friend who had 2 ancestors who fought in this war. Their names were George and John Lowry. They were both Cherokee and both fought under Jackson against the Red Sticks. I mention that because when you're studying history, it's easy to forget sometimes that the people involved lived in the very same world you live in now. We're not detached from the past, we're part of the same continuity, and depending on where we come from and what part of history we're studying, sometimes we're not even that far removed in place and time from the people and the events we're studying. And this is the case with this story. I happen to be friends with a living descendant of some of the people involved. Anyway, Jackson launched a campaign to put down the Red Sticks, and I won't talk in great detail about this war, but it was very one-sided. The Red Sticks were on the run almost immediately, and not quite a year after the attack on Fort Mims, the remaining Red Sticks were cornered at a place called Horseshoe Bend on the Tallapoosa River in Alabama. I'll read you Sedgwick's account of the ensuing fight, and as I read this, take note of two names, Major Ridge and John Ross. Those are both Cherokee members of Jackson's army who will become important later. Sedgwick writes, quote, "If a native people were ever to retreat, and then retreat again, and then again and again, Horseshoe Bend, in today's Dadeville in mid-state Alabama, was the kind of place where they might end up, on a green peninsula created by a wild turn of the vigorous, wide-swinging river that had cut deep into the forest all around it. The dashing Creek commander, William Weatherford, had sheltered the last of his force and their families behind a stout fortification of logs and earth that guarded the entrance to the peninsula, which was elsewhere protected by the brisk but dirty river that swerved around it. To Weatherford, the promontory must have seemed not just safe, but somehow sacred, a place chosen by the Great Spirit for a valiant people. Weatherford himself was the sort of daredevil who trusted in fate. It was his idea to exterminate everyone at Fort Mims, only to arouse the concentrated fury of Jackson and the superior forces that had now chased him here to this potential Armageddon on the Tallapoosa. Weatherford had dash, no question. He'd survived one battle by plunging on horseback off a high cliff into the Arkansas River some 80 feet below. An enormous splash and then nothing but bubbles for several long moments, before Weatherford surged up to the surface, still firmly in the saddle, clinging to the horse's mane with one hand and clutching his rifle with the other. Now he'd found safety for his men behind the surging river and breastworks of fat logs he'd laid out, caulked with mud, and placed over a long mound of dirt with porthole openings for riflemen that ran like the side of a log house across the only link to land. Nature furnishes few situations as eligible for defense, and barbarians have never rendered one more secure by art, Jackson declared later in his report when he had reason to convey that he'd achieved the impossible. In fact, the position mostly offered false comfort to native warriors unversed in modern artillery and the wiles of a canny enemy. This fortress did not keep Jackson's forces out so much as keep the Creeks in, and in a highly precarious position. While the promontory loomed impressively over the river, it was actually slightly lower than the surrounding land, and lowest at the peninsula's neck, its point of entry. Worse, Weatherford was down to just 800 Red Sticks, only a third of them with guns. The rest had to make do with arrows or blades. Jackson had 5,000, all of them fully armed. When Jackson looked down at the lowly Creek outpost, he saw an anthill fit for stomping. He'd ordered his artillery company to drag a pair of powerful cannons 100 miles just for the purpose. They dropped massive balls of lead on this feeble Creek outpost, crushing the fortifications, leaving Jackson to pick off any survivors at his leisure. Shortly after dawn on March 17, 1814, Jackson signaled for his cannons to begin, and great booms echoed through the river canyon. Jackson had arrayed his men all around the lip of land enclosing the river, waiting for the cannonballs to shatter the Creek fortifications below. For hours, the cannons fired their heavy load, rocking with each blast, smoke rising from their iron mouths. But, incredibly, the Creek wall stood just as it had, and the brazen enemy was starting to shout up taunts at the Americans who were so useless in battle. Then a few daring Cherokee warriors led by Major Ridge devised a new plan. With his in-law, Charles Reese, and an immense full-blood aptly called the Whale, and several other men he trusted, Major Ridge climbed down the face of the canyon wall to the riverbed. He set foot on a spot at the peninsula's watery tip, well away from the breastworks that were being so heavily pounded. Major Ridge had spotted a pair of canoes that the Creeks, never imagining an enemy might find them of use, had beached there. Wearing nothing but breechcloths, their heads adorned with twin eagle feathers to distinguish themselves from the enemy, Major Ridge and the others slipped quietly into the river and, with just their eyes above the water like crocodiles, swam smoothly to the far side. Once ashore, the Cherokee grabbed the canoes to swim them back and then ferry across a full contingent of fighters that had by now descended the canyon. Major Ridge took the first boat and, paddling from the stern, his head low, his rifle at his side, slipped the first contingent of warriors across. The Creeks had thrown up some meager huts not far from the water's edge. Cherokee rifle fire shocked the Red Sticks huddled inside, mostly women and children, and sent them running for safety in the barricades. The Cherokee attackers then torched the empty dwellings, drawing attention from the warriors at the breastworks, who'd expected the enemy to attack from the other side. They rushed to fight off Ridge's men, whose eagle feathers let Jackson, watching from above, know they were his Indians. Jackson then ordered thousands more men to scramble down from the cliffs to pour into the breach left where its defenders were pulled away. Jackson sent many more soldiers splashing down into the river to attack from that side too, catching the enemy in a deadly crossfire. Furious Red Stick warriors, knives in hand, closed on Major Ridge and his men, but the Ridge dispatched 6 of them. The last died after a terrific hand-to-hand fight, the 2 combatants thrashing about in the water, each trying to force the other under. Finally, the Ridge pulled the Creek's own knife from his belt and thrust it into his belly, and then another Cherokee finished him with a spear. They left the Creek floating face down, the water reddening around him. Attacked from the front and the back, hundreds more Creeks fell. The carnage was dreadful, Jackson acknowledged later. In a rare attempt at mercy, he sent an emissary to the Creeks to talk peace, but after the Americans' murderous betrayal at Hillaby, the Red Sticks fired on the man and the slaughter continued. When the Red Sticks' guns finally fell silent, the last man dead, Jackson dispatched soldiers to nip off the noses of the fallen to make a count. On land, 557 had perished. The river had claimed at least 350 more. John Ross prepared the Cherokee casualty report. Captain Ridge Company, as Ross termed it, was listed third, marking Major Ridge's official entry into Ross's awareness, although he mistakenly downgraded Ridge's rank. He lists the dead and injured, Cachi, Netwawi, and Woya Hakeski, among many others, and grades their wounds from slight to dangerous. Ross's English defined him, as did his talent for bureaucracy, placing him at a desk at field headquarters, well away from the screams of battle. He was not a man to show up on a list of fallen Cherokee. He was a man to make one. End quote. So that was the end of the Red Stick Rebellion. To sum this up, here's what Mary Jane Ward writes about this war in When the Wolf Came. Quote, "The Red Sticks' devastating attack on Fort Mims, Alabama in 1813 galvanized the southern Anglo-American frontier. General Andrew Jackson then marched Tennessee militia south to subdue the Red Sticks, and contingents of Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and loyal Muskogee warriors joined them. They helped him crush the Red Sticks at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, March 27, 1814. So many Muskogees died that day that the Tallapoosa River ran red with their blood, according to eyewitnesses. The Red Stick Rebellion then merged into the War of 1812 when Jackson led his army on to New Orleans later that year to stop a British invasion. Choctaws fought beside him in the victory that made him a national hero. The southeastern Indians then witnessed Jackson's treatment of his Muskogee allies, enforcing the Treaty of Fort Jackson on them. He punished all Muskogees for the actions of the Red Stick faction by taking, he proudly said, 20 million acres of the cream of the Creek country, opening a communication from Georgia to Mobile. In spite of their demonstrated loyalty to the United States, the southeastern Indians could only wonder what might happen to them in the future." End quote. Now that I mentioned Andrew Jackson, we know where this is going. As white settlers moved further and further into the Southeast throughout the 1810s and 1820s, the U.S. federal government increased pressure on the Indians to relocate west of the Mississippi. That pressure eventually culminated in the Indian Removal Act, signed into law by President Andrew Jackson on May 28, 1830. Now, pretty much everybody has heard of the Trail of Tears, and we'll get to that in a minute. It's right up there with Wounded Knee and Custer's Last Stand as among the most well-known incidents in American history involving Indians. But what's less well known is that the Trail of Tears was only a very small part of the broader forced relocation of the southeastern tribes out to the Indian Territory. The common usage of that term refers specifically to the Cherokee removal of 1837 to 39, and like I said, we'll get to that shortly. But the Removal Act applied to all 5 tribes. The execution of it took more than a decade to fully accomplish, and just the decade of the 1830s and the first part of the 1840s could probably be its own 6-episode series for this reason. But even for a couple decades before the act, as early as the late 1700s in some cases, some groups of Indians had already been moving west to escape the pressure from the Anglos. Ward writes, quote, Indian removal had been an idea under discussion in the federal government at least since the days of President Thomas Jefferson. By the time of President James Monroe, it was becoming a federal policy. In the mid-1820s, about the same time Comanches and Kiowas were setting up their lodges in what would be western Oklahoma, federal officials were increasing pressure on the eastern Indians to move west of the Mississippi River. With Missouri and Arkansas already filling up with settlers, that destination shifted farther west into today's Oklahoma and Kansas. Some Choctaws and Chickasaws were familiar with the Arkansas and Red River valleys of today's Oklahoma because they had hunted, traded, and fought other tribes there from the mid-1700s into the early 1800s. A Cherokee faction, already settled in eastern Arkansas before 1800, increased as still more Cherokees left for the west under the increasing pressure from the federal government. A little later, these old settlers moved on into northwestern Arkansas, and then after 1817 spilled over into today's northeastern Oklahoma as the federal government urged all eastern Indians to sign removal treaties and move west to an Indian territory. Differences of opinion over signing those treaties had a direct impact on the Civil War in the Indian Territory. It was a difficult choice for all 5 of the largest southeastern Indian nations, and it fractured tribal unity while it made internal divisions worse. Some leaders declared that they could not and would not leave what remained of their ancestral lands. Others, though, argued that their best course was to exchange their old homeland for new lands in the Indian Territory. Otherwise, they feared the United States might simply force them out and take their land anyway. Federal negotiators offered guarantees and cash incentives to the Indian governments, as well as to some Indian leaders to persuade them to sign the treaties. Meanwhile, the new state governments of Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi applied their own pressures on their Indian residents while ignoring white lawlessness against them. Grimly, the Muskogee National Council renewed an 1811 law imposing the death penalty on anyone who signed a treaty selling tribal lands without its consent. End quote. Now, the removal and resulting internal divisions affected all 5 nations, but John Sedgwick's book Blood Moon is specifically about the Cherokee, and it seems appropriate to focus primarily on the Cherokee because their internal conflict will end up driving events in the Indian Territory at the beginning of the Civil War, probably more than anybody else's. The story Sedgwick tells centers around those 2 Cherokee leaders I called your attention to at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, John Ross and Major Ridge. Ridge was born in 1771 and was not quite 20 years older than Ross. He was a Cherokee warrior through and through and was heavily involved in the 20-year period of violence between Indians and Anglo settlers during and after the American Revolution. Like many Cherokee of this period, he was part white, but still nearly full-blood Cherokee, and he went on the warpath for the first time at 17 years old. Before the Creek War, he was just known as the Ridge, which comes from his Cherokee name, Ganundalegi, meaning he who walks on the ridge. In his early 40s, by the time of the Creek War, he was promoted to the rank of Major in Jackson's army, and from that time on was known by Major as his English first name. John Ross was a completely different kind of man. Born in 1790, he was from a younger, newer generation of Cherokee, which had an increasingly tenuous connection to the old traditional ways of Ridge's generation and before. By descent, Ross himself was only 1/8 Cherokee at the most, possibly less. He was mostly descended from Scottish settlers to Appalachia. Where Ridge spoke the Cherokee language and throughout his life only ever learned a few words of English, Ross barely spoke any Cherokee at all. Where Ridge came from a traditional Cherokee background and was a rough-and-ready warrior, Ross came from what amounted to basically frontier aristocracy. This is how Sedgwick, in his introduction, characterizes the rift within the Cherokee Nation over removal. He says, quote, "The two sides were given body and voice by two proud Cherokee who loomed over the great debate like two great peaks on either side of a valley split by a raging river. John Ross and a man known as the Ridge. One the longtime principal chief, the other his primary counselor, and then his fiercest opponent. Their philosophies and personalities were so distinct as to name the two political parties that rose up over the issue, the Ross Party and the Ridge Party, one to stay, the other to go. Everything about them expressed their differences. The Ridge, short for He Who Walks on Mountaintops, was a big, imposing, copper-skinned Cherokee, a fearsome warrior turned plantation owner, whose voice quieted any room, and whose physique awed anyone who crossed his path. Smaller, almost 20 years younger, Ross was descended from Scottish traders and looked like one. A pale, unimposing half-pint who wore Eastern clothes, from laced shoes to a top hat. If the Ridge radiated the power of a Cherokee who could drop a buck at 100 paces, Ross could have strolled into an Edinburgh dinner party without receiving undue attention. Tellingly, the Ridge spoke almost no English, and Ross almost no Cherokee. Raised at either end of the string of Cherokee settlements from Tennessee down into Alabama, they were each a combination of Cherokee and Scottish, but in radically different proportions, and so demonstrated the startling variety of a seemingly homogeneous population. Cherokee skin ranged from a glowing tan to parchment white. In adulthood, the two men emerged as the two great leaders of the nation, statesmen both, united in their devotion to their Cherokee heritage, although no two men could have seen it more differently. Together, they created the first national Cherokee government, with a constitution, a legislature, and a Supreme Court, which certified the Cherokee as the most civilized tribe in America. In those halcyon years of the 1820s, the two worked together in backslapping harmony. It wasn't hard to picture them, on a warm evening, sitting together in the shade of the elms under the porch of the Ridge's fine house, sipping whiskey, although both professed not to drink it, and laughing into the night. But President Andrew Jackson's hard push for removal touched something in them, a tension over whether to resist or to accommodate, that set each against the other, permanently. What started as an honest disagreement between friends developed into an active distrust that hardened into antagonism and then became a blinding hatred that consumed everything. A blood feud, in short, that went from personal vendetta to clan war to a civil war that swept through the entire Cherokee Nation before it got caught up in the even greater cataclysm of the American War between the states." End quote. Now, counterintuitively, Ross, who was barely Cherokee at all, came to represent the full-blood, anti-removal segment of the Cherokee population, and Ridge, who was far more Cherokee than Ross but still a mixed blood, represented the mixed blood pro-removal segment. It's important to remember that although Ross and his party were against removal, they were not against modernization, and they didn't necessarily want to be isolated from the whites. After all, Ross was instrumental in creating the modernized Cherokee national government along with Ridge. In fact, the Cherokee had been fairly united against the Red Sticks during the Creek War. Tecumseh was the guy who wanted to form a pan-Indian alliance to push the Anglos back into the sea, but as a Shawnee, he was not part of any of the 5 civilized tribes. At the time of the Red Stick Rebellion, Cherokee leaders like Ridge had already come around to the idea of staying in their current lands and coexisting alongside the United States. That's why they were making efforts to modernize and civilize their tribes, and as far as they were concerned, Tecumseh and the Red Sticks were about to ruin it for everybody, and that's why they chose to fight against them. And the rift between Ross and Ridge reflects a divide over the issue of removal not just within the Cherokee Nation, but across the 5 civilized tribes, between the full-bloods and the mixed bloods. Another book I read on this is called Caught in the Maelstrom, The Indian Nations in the Civil War, 1861 to 1865, by Clint Crow. And Crow says that the divide was especially strong in the Cherokee and Creek nations. The Creek Nation was more or less divided into 2 parts by the 1820s. The lower Creeks, who lived along the Gulf Coast, were more integrated with the Anglo-Americans and favored removal, and the upper Creeks, who lived further north and inland, were far less integrated and opposed removal. Now, the further I got into reading about this period, the more I realized just how much I was going to have to gloss over, and we really are going to barely scratch the surface of the history of Indian removal from the Southeast. I'll probably have to bite the bullet and do a whole series on it sometime later, but for now, I'll just give a brief rundown of how each of the 5 civilized tribes handled removal. And I'll give a little more detail on the Cherokee specifically, since from what I can tell, they were the most important of the 5 as concerns the Civil War. The second most important was probably the Creeks, and some of them had already been working towards removal treaties with the federal government even before the Indian Removal Act was passed in 1830. William McIntosh, the mixed-blood principal chief of the pro-removal Lower Creeks, signed the Treaty of Indian Springs in February 1825, which gave up lands in Georgia and Alabama in exchange for new lands west of the Mississippi. But of course, there was another part of the nation, the Upper Creeks, who opposed removal. Ward writes, quote, Opothle Yahola of Tukbatchee Town, sent by the council to observe that meeting, left immediately to report on the new treaty. The National Council quickly condemned McIntosh and the other signers and appointed Minawa, a well-known war leader and former Red Stick, to execute their death sentence. He and a party of 100 men from Okfuskee Town surrounded McIntosh's home and ordered the white men to leave along with all the women and children. Chief McIntosh's son, Chili, also a signer of the treaty, escaped unnoticed because of his light skin and carried out his little brother, Daniel N. McIntosh. When only Chief William McIntosh and one other signer remained in the house, the executioners set fire to it and shot them down as they ran out the door. End quote. Remember those names, Opothle Yahola, Chili McIntosh, and Daniel McIntosh, because they'll all be important later in the Civil War, especially Opothle Yahola. You can think of their 2 factions, the Opothle Yahola faction and the McIntosh faction, as being the Muskogee counterparts to the Ross and Ridge factions in the Cherokee Nation. Well, for a few years after the assassination of William McIntosh, civil war over removal threatened to engulf the Muskogee Nation, and the McIntosh party started moving out west. It took until 1832 for the Upper Creek full-bloods under Opothle Yahola to see the writing on the wall and agree to removal by signing the Treaty of Washington. But even then, they were allowed 5 years to actually complete the removal, and there were still enough of them left in Alabama by 1836 to allow for a minor uprising in response to aggression from white settlers. That rebellion was put down by General Winfield Scott, and it turned out to be the last straw for the federal government. Ward quotes several first-hand accounts of the forced removal of the Muskogee, the first one from a woman called Sally Farney. Quote, The command for a removal came unexpectedly upon most of us. There was the time that we noticed that several overloaded wagons were passing our home, yet we did not grasp the meaning. However, it was not long until we found out the reason. Wagons stopped at our homes, and the men in charge commanded us to gather what few belongings could be crowded into the wagon. We were to be taken away and leave our homes, never to return. This was just the beginning of much weeping and heartaches. We were taken to a crudely built stockade and joined others of our tribe. We were kept penned up until everything was ready before we started on the march. Even here, there was the awful silence that showed the heartaches and sorrow at being taken from the homes, and even separation from loved ones. Most of us had not foreseen such a move in this fashion or at this time. We were not prepared, but times became even more horrible after the real journey began. Ward continues, Another account of those days, told by Elsie Edwards of the Ketchobadegi tribal town, came from an elderly woman named Senecha, forced onto a boat bound for the Indian Territory. Quoting Senecha, When the events, with never no more to live in the East, had taken place, she too remembered that she had left her home, and with shattered happiness she carried a small bundle of her few belongings, and reopening and retying her pitiful bundle she began a sad song which was later taken up by the others on board the ship at the time of the wreck, and the words of her song was, I have no more land, I am driven away from home, driven up the red waters, let us all go, let us all die together, and somewhere upon the banks we will be there. Back to Ward. Many did die along that road to the Indian Territory. According to Sally Farney, quoting Farney again, many fell by the wayside, too faint with hunger or too weak to keep up with the rest. The aged, feeble, and sick were left to perish by the wayside. A crude bed was quickly prepared for these sick and weary people. Only a bowl of water was left within reach. Thus they were left to suffer and die alone. The little children cried day after day from weariness, hunger, and illness. Many of the men, women, and even the children were forced to walk. The sick and the births required attention, yet there was no time, or no one was prepared. Death stalked at all hours, but there was no time for proper burying or ceremonies. My grandfather died on this trip. A hastily cut piece of cottonwood contained his body. There were several men carrying reeds with eagle feathers attached to the end. These men continually circled around the wagon trains or during the night around the camps. Their purpose was to encourage the Indians not to be heavy-hearted, nor to think of their homes that had been left. Some of the older women sang songs that meant, "We are going to our home and land. There is one who is above and ever watches over us. He will care for us." Many a family was forced to abandon their few possessions and necessities when their horses died or were too weary to pull the heavy wagons any further. And back to Ward. The forced removal of the Muskogee people who had remained in Alabama after the McIntosh faction left occurred during the bitter winter of 1836 to 1837. They arrived to find little or none of the supplies and tools promised in their treaty. They had no food, clothing, or shelter in this strange land. It is believed that almost all the infants, young children, and elders died on the way or shortly afterward, so that the total Muskogee population declined by about 40% in those early Indian Territory years. The McIntosh faction, who had brought their belongings and supplies with them in 1827 to 1828, had built new homes and established farms along the fertile Arkansas River Valley. Those who survived the forced removal of the 1830s eventually settled farther south and west along the Canadian River and its North Fork and Deep Fork. The factions worked toward reconciliation, and eventually the hard feelings subsided while the Muskogee people rebuilt their nation in the West. End quote. The Choctaw Nation had a pretty close brush with civil war over removal in 1830, but avoided actually coming to blows. Like the other tribes, they had already seen some of their members move west even before the Removal Act. When the act was passed, their chiefs saw the writing on the wall and started preparing the rest of the nation to move, which started in the winter of 1831 to 32. Their move went more smoothly than the Muskogees, owing largely to the fact that they moved out before they were physically forced to. But even then, Ward says that sickness and cold killed at least 2,000 Choctaws during the migration, and if you include the ones who died in their new lands as they were trying to get settled, that amounts to well over 10% of the Choctaw population. The Chickasaw also avoided bloodshed, and Ward characterizes their trip as the most peaceful and orderly of all the tribes. Their original lands were the furthest west of the 5 civilized tribes, which meant they had less distance to travel to get to the Indian Territory. Their chiefs managed the process better, and they were able to delay the move until 1837, which meant that when it finally came, the people had known it was coming for a long time and were better prepared to move. Even so, they suffered on the trail just like the other tribes and lost hundreds to disease. The Choctaw and Chickasaw would settle alongside each other in the Indian Territory. The Seminole were a completely different story. The Seminole Wars are yet another topic worth doing a whole series on, so I won't talk about them in detail here. They were the smallest of the 5 civilized tribes to begin with. They just didn't have the numbers or influence of nations like the Cherokee and Muskogee, and didn't play as big of a role in the events of 1861, so I have to stay relatively focused on the topic at hand. But out of all the tribes, they resisted removal by far the hardest and longest. While the Cherokees, Creeks, and Chickasaws were marching down the Trail of Tears in the late 1830s, the Seminoles were fighting the brutal 6-year-long Second Seminole War against the federal government in the Florida Everglades. In fact, the town of Osceola, Missouri, which we talked about in Part 6 and was burned to the ground by the Lane Brigade in 1861, was named after the famous Seminole war chief Osceola, who fought in this war. And the Seminoles resisted to the bitter end. There was no actual treaty to end the Second Seminole War, and there was enough left unresolved that a third Seminole War was fought from 1855 to 58, and only after that did the bulk of the remaining Seminole population finally surrender and move out west. There were only a couple thousand of them in the Indian Territory as of 1861, which is a large part of the reason they don't play as big of a role in this story as some of the other nations. Now, like I said before, I'm going to give the most attention to the Cherokee because it's largely their internal politics that will end up driving the events of 1861, and buckle up because this is about to be a wild ride. First, we need to get to know the two Cherokee factions a little better. The main mover in the Ross Party was John Ross himself. Of course, he had his family members and political allies, one of which was the aforementioned George Lowry, but it seems the party really did revolve around his own person. The Ridge Party was a little different. Although it was headed by Major Ridge, there were at least 3 other leaders of the party who had come to play important roles. Those were Ridge's son, John Ridge, and his 2 nephews, Buck Wadey and Stand Wadey. Now, Buck Wadey is not usually known by that name. Buck Wadey was his childhood name, but in 1818, as a teenager, he was sent along with John Ridge and a couple other Cherokees to attend the Foreign Mission School at Cornwall, Connecticut. On this trip back east, he met a man named Elias Boudinot. This is what Sedgwick writes about that. Quote, "One last step in Burlington, New Jersey, to see one of the great benefactors of the American Board, the aged Elias Boudinot, early president of the Continental Congress, former head of the American Bible Society, and backer of all manner of worthy causes. When the 4 students gathered before him in his parlor, he lit on the gentle, soft-eyed Buck Wadey, and soon made an unusual proposition. He had no son, he explained, and no one to carry on his lineage. Would Buck Wadey be willing to change his name to Elias Boudinot? That was quite a request. Buck Wadey was a frisky native Cherokee, son of David Wadey of the Deer Clan. Elias Boudinot was a doddering, plump, lily-white American statesman of French extraction. Could Buck Wadey really become Elias Boudinot? Was that like casting off buskins for broadloom cloth, or a true translation of souls? Or nothing at all, just words? Whatever it was, Buck had to feel like he was moving up if he could be a Boudinot, and moving up was the whole idea. His answer was, sure. And so Buck Wadey became Elias Boudinot, the last syllable pronounced in the American manner, not, which fitted, as he was indeed not Boudinot. But he was not Buck Wadey either, for Buck Wadey was no more. End quote. From that time on, Buck Wadey was known as Elias Boudinot, and although this might be a little confusing, you just have to remember that Elias Boudinot and Stand Wadey are brothers. They're both cousins to John Ridge and nephews to Major Ridge, and the 4 of them together make up the main leadership of the Ridge Party. You also have to remember that Major Ridge was about 20 years older than John Ross, and although he was the patriarch of the family and the spiritual leader of the party, by the time of the Removal Act, he had already sort of started passing the torch of political leadership on to his son, John Ridge. And John Ridge, in a lot of ways, made more sense as a political leader than his father. Major Ridge had been a warrior, and by the 1830s, he almost looked like a relic of a bygone era. The Cherokee Nation had changed immensely since his youth, and its efforts to ingratiate itself with the United States called for a new kind of leader, a political leader, someone who was educated in the ways of not just the Cherokee, but the white man too, and could bridge the gap between the two worlds. Major Ridge was smart enough to see early on that this was what was needed, and that's why he took great pains to make sure his son John was educated. John Ridge had at least one other major advantage that his father didn't, and that was fluency in both the Cherokee language and the English language. Remember, Major Ridge never learned to speak English at all. So John Ridge had already become the public face of the Ridge Party in a way. Now, initially, especially before the Removal Act, Ross and Ridge were in agreement on the question of moving out west. Neither of them wanted to do it. They wanted to stay where they were and keep their ancestral lands. Both Ross and Ridge played instrumental roles in modernizing the Cherokee Nation and forging its new civilized government. This stuff was done in an effort to say to the United States, basically, We know you see us as savages, but we want to show you that we're capable of civilizing ourselves by your standards and forming ourselves into a sovereign nation worthy of existing alongside yours. Ross and Ridge thought that if they could do that, then the United States would allow the Cherokee to stay where they were and exist as a sovereign, independent nation. But the funny thing about national sovereignty is that it's really kind of a tenuous thing unless you're actually strong enough to enforce your own sovereignty. If you're not capable of defending your own borders, can you really be said to have sovereignty at all? Seems doubtful to me. And make no mistake, the Cherokee Nation may have been powerful as Indian tribes went, but it was nowhere near powerful enough to actually defend its borders if the U.S. ever decided to make a concerted effort to force them out. So, no matter what treaties may have been signed over the years, no matter what American laws may have been passed or Supreme Court decisions made that either treated the Cherokee as a sovereign nation or said that they were sovereign, in reality, Cherokee sovereignty was an illusion. And it would only be kept up as long as the United States were willing to not press the issue. And in 1830, the U.S. did press the issue with the Indian Removal Act. John Ross and his party would resist this act tooth and nail for the next 7 years. And again, Ridge was initially in agreement with Ross. But Ridge and his party changed their minds. And it's worth thinking about why they changed their minds. The short answer to that, I think, is that they saw the writing on the wall. They knew very well that the Cherokee were not strong enough to resist if the United States ever decided to remove them by force, and therefore national sovereignty was illusory. The more interesting question, I think, is actually why John Ross apparently didn't see this. I'll come back to that, but I think the Ridges are somewhat easier to understand. The moment when the Ridges saw the writing on the wall seems to have had a lot to do with an 1832 Supreme Court case called Worcester versus Georgia. I could get super deep into another tangent with this, but I'll just give it to you in a nutshell. The short version is that the state of Georgia had been getting pretty aggressive with the Cherokee within its borders for several years by 1832, owing in no small part to the discovery of gold on Cherokee land in 1828 and the ensuing Georgia gold rush. Bet you didn't know about that. But anyway, the state of Georgia wanted the Cherokee gone, and they'd been getting aggressive about that in various ways, including the use of the state militia to force them out. The Worcester in that case is a man named Samuel Worcester, who was a Congregationalist minister from Vermont who came to Georgia as a missionary to the Cherokee. Again, these damn meddling Yankees are always sticking their noses into other people's business and causing trouble. Anyway, Worcester started working with the Cherokee and with his sponsoring body, the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missionaries, to resist the aggression of the Georgians against the Cherokee by legal means. He actually became close friends with Elias Boudinot. In response to his efforts, Georgia passed a law in 1830 which prohibited all non-Indians from living on Indian land within the borders of Georgia without express written permission from the state government of Georgia. This law was clearly targeted at Worcester and a few other missionaries like him. Eventually, Worcester was arrested and imprisoned for violating this law, and the case made it to the Supreme Court as the aforementioned Worcester versus Georgia. The case was decided in favor of Worcester in a 6-1 decision with Justice Henry Baldwin dissenting. The Supreme Court only had 7 justices back then. The majority opinion stated, first of all, that the Georgia law was unconstitutional, but more importantly, it said that the Cherokee had a sovereign nation. That was a really big deal and a major win for the Cherokee in their political campaign against removal, because if they had a sovereign nation like the Supreme Court had ruled, then the aggression by Georgia would have to stop, and the U.S. federal government would be obligated to step in and protect Cherokee sovereignty if necessary. Except, it didn't. President Andrew Jackson made it very clear very quickly that he wasn't going to enforce this ruling, and that the federal government wasn't going to lift a finger to stop Georgia's aggression against the Cherokee. And this goes right back to that question of sovereignty. If you're depending completely on a foreign nation to enforce your sovereignty, can you really say you have sovereignty at all? It's worth thinking for a minute about why Jackson would make this decision. In the popular imagination today, he's known as the president who signed the Removal Act. People think he just had it in for the Indians and wanted them gone, and this decision seems to fit with that interpretation. But I actually think it's more complicated than that. Now, these are kind of half-baked thoughts. I'm not super studied up on this piece of the history, so take this with a grain of salt. But consider that the nullification crisis was happening right around the same time as Worcester versus Georgia. Those of you who favor the Southern side in the Civil War should know good and well what the nullification crisis was, but I won't explain it in detail here. But suffice it to say that it involved the state of South Carolina defying federal law. President Jackson's response to that was to threaten South Carolina with invasion by a federal army, which ultimately worked and brought the state to heel. At nearly the same time, Georgia was also defying federal law by continuing their aggression against the Cherokee, and Jackson decided to do nothing about that. So what gives? Both situations had something to do with the tension between state and federal power. Both were cases of states defying federal law. Georgia was allowed to remain in defiance, South Carolina wasn't. Why the difference? I'm wondering if Jackson wasn't a far smarter real-world politician than he tends to get credit for. Remember, Georgia had for several years been happily employing state-sanctioned violence against the Cherokee. South Carolina, on the other hand, had not taken any violent action related to its nullification of the tariffs of 1828 and 1832. Maybe Jackson calculated that a show of force was likely to bring South Carolina to heel without actual violence, maintaining both peace and federal power. On the other hand, a similar show of force was less likely to work against Georgia, which had already shown itself ready and willing to use force of its own. Throw in that the nation was already heavily divided over slavery in the early 1830s. If you tried a show of force against Georgia and Georgia resisted, maybe Georgia gets help from its neighbors like Alabama and the Carolinas. Maybe you end up with something like a full-blown civil war 3 decades before it actually happened in our timeline. Maybe Jackson, like a sensible ruler, was calculating to avoid this outcome at all costs, even against the interests of the Cherokee who had fought alongside him in the Creek War in 1813. Like I said, these are half-baked thoughts, and I don't know this history well enough to really know what Jackson was thinking or what his motivations might have been. But the reason I bring this up at all is that this decision by Jackson had a major impact on the Ridges, especially Major Ridge himself. Major Ridge had fought alongside Jackson in the Creek War. He knew the man, and it seems that because of that history, the Ridges had something of an honorable or respectful relationship with Jackson. They figured that if Jackson wasn't going to help him, no one would, and the Cherokee would be better off west of the Mississippi. I'll read a kind of extended passage from Blood Moon here to kind of explain this from the Ridges' perspective. Quote, "In his defense, Jackson may have ignored the interests of the Cherokee because he was attending to the higher interests of the nation. The case was called Worcester versus Georgia, but it was really Georgia versus the United States of America. For if the United States was obligated to enforce Worcester's victory, it would quickly turn a speck of trouble over a missionary or two into a colossal war between the federal government and the recalcitrant South. Georgia had too much invested in its land policy, outrageous as that policy might have been, to acquiesce without a fight. Neighboring South Carolina would probably have rushed to its defense, and who knew how many other southern states, likewise committed to defend slavery and passionate in their convictions about states' rights, would have followed suit. Jackson would have had quite a fight on his hands, and for what? Horrified as what they saw as Jackson's intransigence, Ridge and Boudinot broke off their lectures to hurry to Washington to plead with him to reconsider. Jackson agreed to see them, but his removal policy was still in effect, and would always remain so. Period. Georgia could do what it wanted with the Cherokee Nation. Remarkably, he insisted once again that he did this out of his enduring friendship with the Cherokee, and in fact with John Ridge himself. Perhaps it was flattery, but he made it clear he had no use for John Ross anymore. Pushy, self-important windbags like Ross had been anathema to Jackson all his life. John Ridge was a cloth of another cut altogether. Whatever the intent, John Ridge must have taken these words from the great father as earnest praise, for he went so far as to name his next son after the president, Andrew Jackson Ridge. Perhaps this was an inheritance from his father, but John Ridge accepted it as truth. Jackson was a friend of the Cherokee, and it was as a friend that he wished the Cherokee would leave. Jackson had already hired a federal agent to oversee and hasten their exodus. Major Benjamin Curry, a crisp Tennessean not known for his love of Indians. But he too was there for the Cherokees' own good. John Ridge maintained a public face of stoic resistance in his letters to Ross, in his remarks to the newspapers, and even to his stalwart, rough-hewn cousin Stan Wadey, son of Major Ridge's brother Wadey. Stan Wadey was filling in as editor of the Phoenix while his brother Elias was away. But others who saw John Ridge when he left Jackson's office saw the look of bitter defeat. One of Jackson's closest advisors, Amos Kendall, saw the normally upthrust young man after that last pivotal meeting. He must have sagged, for Kendall saw him weighed down with the melancholy feeling that he had heard the truth. Jackson's truth, to be sure, but that was all the truth there was right now. He was convinced that the only alternative to save his people from moral and physical death was to make the best terms they could with the government and remove out of the limits of the state. It was hopeless. The Cherokee had done everything to better themselves, but they were still to be removed like the bearers of contagion. The whites had promised to treat them better, and instead had treated them worse. A cripple who had willed himself to walk, who had faced down humiliations in Cornwall, who had become more white than white, John Ridge had now taken a boot in the face. His father's massive pride would never accept such humiliation, and his cousin Boudinot seemed oblivious to slights. But, for all the force of his rhetoric and the majesty of his exquisite tailoring, John Ridge was not so unreachable. Treated with such frankness by Jackson, he did not glower with indignation or deliver a blast of fury, but went ice cold, taking Jackson's grim words for harsh truth. But he resolved that, while his people might be crushed, he never would be. The Cherokee had always been embattled. That was the nature of tribal life. Their boundaries were never fixed by a shoreline, let alone a surveyor's pole. These boundaries depended on a loose understanding that was always subject to revision. Their historic willingness to cede vast tracts of land reflected their lack of fixed points. Ross may have drawn a line in the sand, not another foot, but Jackson and the Georgians had stepped over it with a sneer. The whole Cherokee idea had been a fantasy. There was no Cherokee nation. Without a vast ocean or impassable mountains for protection, it lacked the resources any nation needs to assert and defend itself. It had no military worth the name, just a few thousand aging warriors who were no match for a modern fighting force. When Major Ridge had led a bunch of warriors in face paint against the Pony Club, the results could hardly have been more disastrous. The Cherokee government had been outlawed, its laws suspended, its treasury depleted. It had few roads, a smattering of one-room missionary schools. While the elite had advanced, the vast majority of Cherokee continued to live as they always had lived, with little concept of life past the horizon. John Ridge had to think that John Marshall had it right the first time. This was a ward state, and it was a pathetic one, dependent on a vastly larger and more powerful nation that was proving indifferent to it, and powerless to hold off the mounting cruelties of Georgia on their own. The crisis had become existential. All or nothing. The Cherokee were being told to give up everything, and they had no choice but to agree. There was no way around it. The Ridges' magnificent dreams for their people were over. When he finally returned home to the Oostenaula in midsummer, after so many months away, John Ridge must have feared the reaction of his proud, imperious, often snarling father. He'd think John a traitor, or worse, a coward, to talk of surrender, of selling out his people. The son was braced for that, surely. A man of great intellect and immense feeling, but physically frail and now spent, John Ridge was now about to tell his aging warrior father that he was accepting defeat. But Major Ridge had not been idle while his son was away. He had been out in the countryside to see for himself the state of the Cherokee people, and he'd seen how broken they were. Their lands trampled, their homes in jeopardy, hounded on every side. He could see they no longer had a place in the nation. It was tragic, but he could see it was hopeless. The Cherokee had to go. It is doubtful the Ridges ever embraced over that, but they might have, since their feelings were so much as one. More likely, they simply spoke to each other in the solemn tones by which Cherokee had always related the truth. And the talk might well have been brief, for once they agreed, yes, we must all go, there was little left to say. The Ridges, father and son, would lead the Cherokee to a promised land, whether they wanted to go or not. End quote. So this is another reality of Indians dealing with the United States that you might not think about very often, but is definitely an important aspect of this, which is that the United States at this time is not a monolith. It's very much not the highly centralized state that it will become after the Civil War, and especially into the 20th century. The fact is that the Indian tribes don't just have to deal with the federal government. They also have to deal with state and local governments, like that of Georgia. And the amount of power the federal government actually has over the states, practically speaking, can vary quite a lot depending on the particular place and time. The Choctaw and Chickasaw dealt with something kind of similar to this, where they lived in Mississippi before their removal, although in general the Georgians were probably more aggressive toward the Cherokee than the Mississippians were to the Choctaw and Chickasaw. But if officials at different levels of government in the United States have different ideas of how exactly to deal with the Indians, then the actual policy that gets implemented in reality can end up looking kind of schizophrenic. Everybody has their own interests to look out for, and in this case, even if Jackson had wanted to let the Cherokee stay where they were, it's highly doubtful he would have been willing to risk a civil war over that by cracking down on Georgia. But whatever the case, this is when the Ridges changed their minds and broke with Ross on the issue of removal, and it was probably the most consequential turning point in this whole story as far as the Cherokee are concerned. The decision, as far as they were concerned, was between going west and remaining Cherokee, or staying east, being assimilated into the United States, and losing the Cherokee national identity. They preferred the former option, and so they spread talk of removal among the people, gained the support of most of the mixed bloods, and started seeking out a treaty with Jackson's government. In response to that, Ross doubled down on anti-removal, somehow getting the full-bloods on his side in spite of being mostly Scottish by ancestry. Sedgwick seems to take a pretty dim view of Ross, like he was willfully blind to the reality of the situation and the fact that removal was inevitable. I can't say for sure what Ross's motives might have been, of course, but I will say that I find the story Sedgwick tells compelling. In 1832, elections were due to be held for the office of Principal Chief, which Ross had held since its creation in 1828. Sedgwick writes, quote, "Now that 4 years had passed since Ross and the members of the council had first been voted in, the Cherokee Constitution required fresh elections. This was essential for a democracy, needless to say, but Ross shocked the assemblage by decreeing that this year no vote would be held after all, and he persuaded the council to go along. That left all the incumbents, Ross included, in place until Ross deemed the nation ready to resume the democratic process. In the current crisis, Ross declared, the nation simply could not risk further discord. To the Ridges and their backers, this was the very reason to have an election, to give the people a voice in charting the nation's course at such an uncertain time. Besides, Major Ridge had the idea that his son, John, handsome, worldly, and well-spoken, might now lead them as principal chief himself. The Major was not alone in this. Even the sleepy-eyed Governor Lumpkin of Georgia, the former congressman who'd taken over from Gilmer, believed that John Ridge made John Ross a mere pygmy. But then, Lumpkin had ample reason to favor John Ridge's openness to removal. Ross, always attuned to threats to his own power, could not have helped noticing the flash in John Ridge's eyes, the sharp way Ridge handled himself. Ridge made Ross seem plain, and his speeches tedious, the drone of a mosquito in the ear. But Ross did know politics. The Ridges might have the mixed bloods, but he had the full bloods, who were still far more numerous and still, whether out of belief or ignorance, committed to the old ways. Hunting was scarce, but the spirits still abounded in the woods, and so did the joy that these gaily dressed traditionalists took in the land of their forefathers. The exuberance was almost as palpable as the earth itself, evident in every giddy stomp of the green corn dance, in every flavorful kernel of the corn that grew from the soil. Exactly how this virtuous Scot captured the enduring devotion of the full-bloods is a mystery. They may have trusted him to handle the alien powers in Washington and Georgia because he was one with them. For whatever reason, Ross did hold the full-bloods, and he quickly stamped out all this foolish talk of needing an election. No full-blood would ever question him." End quote. And this rift got bitter pretty quick. Ross didn't just oppose the Ridges, he vilified them. A little bit later, Sedgwick writes, quote, "The Ridges were now under assault. In the Phoenix, editor Elijah Hicks devoted the few non-religious column inches to attacking the patriotism of his predecessor, Elias Boudinot. John Ross started to recast his followers not merely as a faction, but as a true party, the Patriot Party, sometimes the National Party. Their opponents, led now by the Ridges, would form into the Treaty Party, but to the Ross men they were simply traitors. The nation was splitting in two. In an essay the Phoenix refused to publish, Boudinot declared that he himself was the true patriot, for his patriotism consisted of the love of the country and the love of the people. To Boudinot, any claim by Ross to the first denied the second, for Ross's commitment to the land would only bring pain to the people he professed to love. Our lands, or a large part of them, are about to be seized and taken from us, Boudinot cried. Now, as a friend of my people, I cannot say, peace, peace, when there is no peace. I cannot ease their minds with any expectation of a calm, when the vessel is already tossed to and fro, and threatened to be shattered to pieces by an approaching tempest. Given what he knew, he had no choice. If I really believe there is danger, I must act consistently, and give alarm. Tell our countrymen our true, or what I believe our true, situation. In the case under consideration, I am induced to believe there is danger, immediate and appalling, and it becomes the people of this country to weigh the matter rightly, ask wisely, not rashly, and choose a course that will come nearest to benefiting the nation. It was the clairvoyant's dilemma, as old as Cassandra. How to make a dire prediction without being dismissed as a crackpot or an enemy. Just to identify a problem can make a seer the source of it, and then an object of scorn if the solution means that people must abandon their homes, their heritage, and the bones of their ancestors, and journey to a distant land that could be harsher than the one they'd left. And no glory would ever come to those who counseled removal, for no one would ever be able to say for sure that it wouldn't have been better to stay. No, the sensible position for a politician was to preach staying, and later, if necessary, leave with the utmost reluctance, blaming those who had actively pushed removal for its hazards, and taking no responsibility for the consequences. By that standard, only a fool would openly advocate going, and Ross was no fool. Always the more astute politician, Ross never got too far ahead of his supporters, those full-bloods who hung on the Cherokee translation of his every word, only too happy to be shielded from reality. End quote. In 1833, the Ridges, along with Ross's ne'er-do-well brother Andrew, went to Washington themselves to try to strike a treaty with the federal government for removal. No agreement was struck, but the attempt was seen by the Ross party as an act of treachery. As a result, both Major Ridge and John Ridge were impeached and removed from their post on the Cherokee National Council in the following year, 1834. A member of the Ridge Party, John Walker Jr., was shot and killed by a Ross man, Tom Foreman. The two of them seem to have had some history. That killing didn't just come out of nowhere, but almost like the killing of Charles Dow in Kansas in 1855, it just fueled the factional strife. No punishment was ever handed out to Foreman and his accomplice in the killing, Anderson Springston, even though no one ever really doubted their guilt, and they never even claimed innocence themselves. As the situation descended into potential increasing violence, the Ridges pulled the Charles Robinson move. They set up a parallel government of their own, complete with its own council, with John Ridge as principal chief. This stuff only got worse over the next few years, and there's a lot of details to the ongoing treaty negotiations that I'm going to gloss over, but I wanted to lay out how this rift within the Cherokee Nation got started. And although Sedgwick seems to not like John Ross very much, he has his criticisms of the Ridges too, namely that they didn't seem to be very politically adept. He writes, quote, "If the loyalty that John Ridge inspired ran deep, it was also narrow, and barely reached beyond the literate few who made up the true believers. Ross commanded thousands, but they commanded him too, as he was obliged to conform to the unfounded hopes of the ill-informed. He must have known that the official course he'd set would lead nowhere good. It may have been his own misfortune that Ross had not stood for election in 1832. Unsure of his public support, he may have overpromised for it, locking himself into an unreasonable position that, ultimately, he could defend only with violence. For his part, Ridge's erudition and his brilliance may have proved a hindrance that won him those few powerful elites at the cost of more humble followers. He imagined that he alone could see the peril, and this blinded him to the fact that his remedy had its perils too. Ever since Cornwall, he'd felt persecuted, not unreasonably, and that gave a cold edge to his missionary self-righteousness. He needed patience and sympathy to warm the people to an unwelcome message, but instead he pushed it on them, and when they resisted, he pushed it on them harder. He'd decide what was good for them, as he knew better, and he probably did know better. But that was not the way to win them. In short, Ridge might have been the better seer, but Ross was the better politician. The Cherokee had to choose between them. End quote. Of course, Andrew Jackson had an interest in this political competition within the Cherokee Nation, and of course he favored the Ridge Party. And that is why the Ridge Party was able to do what they did in late December of 1835. They met at the Cherokee capital of New Echota in northern Georgia without the approval of the Ross government and finalized a treaty which had already been rejected by the Cherokee Nation at large. This Treaty of New Echota would sell all remaining Cherokee land to the United States for a price of $5 million. Major Ridge was one of the signers, and as he made his mark on the page, he said, "I have signed my death warrant." We'll come back to why he said that in a minute, because there's a little more to it than just the idea that it would make him unpopular. The treaty was sent to Washington, and it was all Jackson needed. He couldn't really care less how well the treaty represented the will of the Cherokee public. He wanted the Cherokee gone, and this was the ticket. Even after the treaty was signed, though, Ross did everything in his power to delay until the federal government sent troops to force the Cherokee out. And I think you have to lay some of the blame for the ensuing catastrophe at the feet of John Ross. He should have known very well how this was going to go, and yet he delayed, still preaching to his full-blood supporters that the treaty could be resisted and they'd be able to stay in their ancestral homeland. As a result, when the U.S. Army came knocking, the Cherokee were not prepared to move like the Chickasaw were. And it went about like you'd expect. Mary Jane Ward writes in When the Wolf Came, quote, "For $5 million, the treaty party exchanged the eastern Cherokee homeland for additional lands in northeastern Indian Territory, plus the cost of removal and subsistence for 1 year afterward. They moved west during the 2 years grace period, but Ross and his followers repudiated the treaty and refused to emigrate. Out of patience, the federal government sent federal troops to round up the remaining Cherokees and force them west, an event known as the Trail Where They Cried, or the Trail of Tears. Although some of the soldiers took part in looting Cherokee homes, Private John Burnett, a sympathetic Army guard, wrote, "I saw helpless Cherokees arrested and dragged from their homes and driven by bayonet into the stockades. And in the chill of a drizzling rain on an October morning, I saw them loaded like cattle or sheep into 645 wagons and started toward the west." Eventually, 13 emigrating parties set off, some taking different routes, all of them full of hardship, for the Indian Territory. Near Little Rock, Arkansas, Burnett stood vigil the winter night when Mrs. John Ross died of pneumonia. He helped bury her the next morning in a shallow grave. She was one of an estimated 4,000 who died as 18,000 Cherokee were forced west. End quote. And from Sedgwick again, quote, "When the May 23rd deadline passed without any sign of movement, General Winfield Scott's men started in on their grim task. More than 7,000 uniformed federal soldiers, all of them well armed, fanned out through the nation to descend upon the Cherokee in their homes. There, so long misled by their principal chief, these Cherokee must have been dumbfounded to find insolent, rifle-toting soldiers swarming in to roust them from their homes as if the Indians had no more right to stay there than field mice. A half-century later, the Cherokee ethnologist James Mooney interviewed survivors who well remembered the horror of that time. They recalled how bands of soldiers stole silently across fields or through the woods to surround the Cherokees' snug cabins, and then burst in, rifles cocked and bayonets fixed, ready to shoot or stab anyone who resisted. Then, with blows and oaths, they forced the Cherokee outside to tramp off to spare stockades that were miles away. Others were grabbed where they were working in the fields or just ambling down the road. Women were yanked away from their spinning wheels and barked at to come now. Small children were seized as they played and sent to join the long files of wailing Cherokee.
Too often, as the evicted turned for a last look at the homes they'd built and lived in for decades, they saw them in flames, torched by a rabble of jeering whites. Some of the more daring Cherokee responded with contempt, but many more could see that, when they were taken by surprise, defenseless, wildly outnumbered, with their families about, resistance was futile. When the soldiers thundered in on one aging Cherokee patriarch at dinner, he bade the man wait long enough for them to gather his extended family around him for quiet prayers to the Great Spirit to protect them. Then he let the soldiers lead them all away into exile. Too often, after the Cherokee families had been ripped from their homes, white mobs swarmed in to pick the houses clean, then empty the barns, round up any livestock, and even dig up graves to steal the silver pendants and other valuables sometimes buried with the dead. One Georgia volunteer, a veteran soldier, told Mooney that the Cherokee removal was the cruelest work I ever knew. But of course, the Cherokee found it even crueler. The Baptist missionary Evan Jones watched as the Cherokee were rooted out, one by one. The poor captive, in a state of distressing agitation, his weeping wife almost frantic with terror, surrounded by a group of crying, terrified children without a friend to speak a consoling word, he wrote. He watched the soldiers march the families away like cattle, poking any resistors with a bayonet, or whacking them with long sticks that whistled down on shoulders or the side of the head, to keep them all stumbling along. Mortified, wrote Jones, by vulgar and profane vociferations by the soldiers that didn't need to be translated. Soldiers sent everyone plunging across even the swiftest streams, the water sometimes as high as their heads, not allowing them to stop to remove their shoes, which were often lost in the passage. When youngsters fled in terror into the woods, parents were not allowed to collect them, leaving them to grow up alone in the wild, if they lived at all, while their elders were sent to the Indian Territory in Oklahoma. If any Cherokee, whether men or women, complained too hard or dared to push back at these hardened soldiers, they were stripped naked, roped to a tree, and given 100 lashes on their bare backs, their shrieks piercing the air. It did not have to be this way. Illegal as Ross had declared it to be, the new Ochota Treaty had been the law of the United States for 2 years, plenty of time for the Cherokee to settle up their affairs and leave in order. That would have been anguishing, no question, but far better than suddenly being driven from their lives at gunpoint, whipped and beaten, forced to leave behind everything they could not wear or carry, with the summer heat rising. If Ross had told them the truth in time, John Ridge complained, they would have sold off their furniture, their horses, their cattle, hogs, and sheep, and their growing corn. They could have used that money to start afresh. End quote.
As horrible as the Trail of Tears was, of course nothing was over once the surviving Cherokee finally made it to their destination. Almost immediately, the existing two-way political conflict became a three-way conflict, because remember that there were already Cherokees living in the Indian Territory. A small but significant part of the nation had already moved out west, starting all the way back in the 1810s. These were called the Old Settlers, and after a couple of decades living separately from the Eastern Cherokee, they had their own tribal government, their own culture, their own way of doing things, and honestly were probably on track for becoming a completely separate people from the Eastern Cherokee if the separation had continued. But the Eastern Cherokee were forced out and would now be expected to live alongside their Old Settler cousins. And even after the attrition on the Trail of Tears, there were still something like 2 to 3 times as many Eastern Cherokee as there were Old Settlers. So the political reunification of two groups like that could already be kind of a sticky problem on its own. But throw in the division of the Eastern Cherokees along the Ross Ridge Divide and you have a complicated mess. Ross immediately set about pushing for political reunification, under his own leadership, of course, but the Old Settlers were suspicious of him. The root of the Ross Ridge Divide was the issue of removal, and obviously the Old Settlers were not very interested in that at all. They'd already voluntarily moved before removal ever became an issue. They were natural allies to the Ridge Party in a sense, and that was a problem for Ross. As soon as the Ridge Party started interfering with Ross's political plans, Ross was quick to spin the horrors of the Trail of Tears as being their fault. In June of 1839, 100 or so Ross followers met in secret near his home to discuss what to do about the ridges. Sedgwick explains how the Ross party understood what had happened to them back east, and this will shed some light on the significance of Major Ridge's statement that by signing the New Echota Treaty, he'd signed his own death warrant. Quote, on June 20th, more than 100 of Ross's followers gathered in secret not far from his home on Park Hill. Everyone there had lost someone during the removal, or afterward. Many of them had lost close family members, whose deaths all too often were slow and torturous. Now these treaty party men were defying them in the West, too? Would this never end? Blood law. This was the thought raging in everyone's mind that night. No one was to sell Cherokee land without official permission. No one. John Ridge had written this law himself at his father's instigation. The fury had been smoldering for some time, possibly from the moment the ink was dry on the page just after Christmas 1835, now almost 3.5 long years before. Did they not know that the land was not theirs to sell? Land belonged to everyone. That was the Cherokee way. The lordly Ridges might have possessed the nation's finest houses, most expensive farms, most valuable ferries, and now its richest store, but they'd never own the nation, and for all their heirs, they never would own it. That one act of theirs at New Echota had affected Cherokee everywhere, bringing down the wrath of the federal government and the state of Georgia on them, routing them from their homes, pushing them through the long, freezing, deadly march west, only to find more misery when they arrived. And now the western settlers were dead set against them. This was the talk that night. Loud, frenzied, raw, outraged, liquored up. Someone brought out the original text of the Blood Law, as written by John Ridge himself, and read it out in stentorian tones. The Ridge's own words. Did they really think those words did not apply to themselves? Were they above that law, too? Others called out the names of other treaty party men to be charged with the capital crime of selling the eastern lands of the nation. Not just Major Ridge, John Ridge, Elias Boudinot, and Stand Watie, but 3 others as well, John A. Bell, James Starr, and George Adair. All 7 of the accused were prominent, successful men who had found riches here in the West when everyone else was struggling just to survive. To the Ross men, their wealth was exceeded only by their arrogance. This must end, the throng declared. They must end. End quote. The Blood Law, as that passage said, was a law passed by the Ridges themselves in the era before they came to see the writing on the wall about the inevitability of removal, and it prescribed the death penalty for any Cherokee who sold Cherokee lands to the United States. That's why Major Ridge said he was signing his own death warrant, because he knew good and well what the New Echota Treaty was going to look like to the full-bloods. Ross's followers were about to carry out the sentence. They drew lots to see which of their number would be given the assignment of carrying out the executions, or assassinations, depending on whose point of view you want to take on it. John Ross's son, Alan, was given the assignment of going to his father's house and making sure he didn't leave for the next 2 days, without telling him what was happening so as to give Ross plausible deniability for what his followers were about to do. And then it started. I'll read another extended passage from Sedgwick on this. Quote, 2 executioners were assigned to each victim, but as many as 50 took part in delivering what they saw as justice to the convicts. After the meeting broke up, more than 24 men galloped through the next night to reach Honey Creek early Saturday morning, June 22nd. It was still dark when they roped their horses to some trees across the field from the 2-story log house John Ridge had built for his family. It was the last of the pre-dawn moonlight, and silent except for a light rustling through the hay as the men sneaked across the field to the house itself, where they peered in the windows, dark, menacing shapes under soft hats. They saw John Ridge asleep downstairs beside his wife, Sally, their 3 children slumbering nearby. Most of the men split off to surround the house, ready to stop Ridge if he burst out a window. The 2 executioners remained on the porch with a few others until everyone was in place. Then, just as dawn was breaking, one of the killers eased up on the heavy iron latch and swung open the door. Pistol drawn, the lead executioner crept toward the sleeping John Ridge, his heavy boots treading light on the hardwood floor, to bring the tip of the gun barrel to Ridge's temple. He held it there only a moment, and then squeezed the trigger. Nothing. The gun delivered only a click of the hammer. At that, Ridge started, and several others stormed in to pounce on him and drag him in his nightclothes to the door while Sally screamed from the bed. Frail and weak, John Ridge scrabbled desperately on the hardwood floor to defy his assailants, his bony legs kicking feebly. He grabbed for the doorposts before the men yanked him through and then dragged him down the front steps to the bare ground, where they laid him out, surrounded. There, the proud Ridge did not plead for his life, but argued for it, tried to reason with the mob, but the men hollered to drown out his words. 2 men pinned his arms to the ground and others held his feet, and then the rest took out their skinning knives to slice them through Ridge's nightclothes to his slender body, one after another, everywhere. The cuts were not deep enough to kill, just enough to torture, and each one brought a scream of pain. Sally was shrieking from the porch, held back by other conspirators, and Ridge tried to call out to her, but he couldn't be understood for the blood gurgling from his slashed throat. Finally, the men put away their bloody knives, and John Ridge slumped back onto the ground, struggling for breath. Seeing him there, prostrate, the first executioner smashed a muddy boot down on his head, and another did the same, and then another, and then all of them, as if they wanted to mash John Ridge into the dark soil of the despised new land. Finally, when everyone had had a crack at him, they left him there to die, slowly, in agony, as so many of their friends and relations had died. Blood-drenched, mangled, hideously contorted, he lay sprawled on the ground until Sally rushed down to him, the horror-stricken children creeping after her, all convulsed in sobs. Incredibly, he was still alive, and Sally and the children managed to lift him up and carry him back into the house. They laid him out, groaning from his many wounds, on a table, pulled a sheet over his blood-drenched body, and stared at the horror of it all. There before him, his literary son John Rollin wrote later, lay their father, once the glory of the nation, pale in death, Sally beside him, hands clasped in speechless agony. His mother, Susanna, was there too, having rushed down from her house at the commotion, her long white hair flung loose over her shoulders, crying to the Great Spirit to sustain her in that dreadful hour. Neighbors crowded in, too, some of whom, John Rollin darkly declared, must have known of the assassination attempt, since the Ridge's enemies were everywhere, and had come to smile over the scene. And then, slowly, as everyone gazed down at him in horror or wonderment, the life seeped out of John Ridge until he was no more. Another band of killers, 30 strong, had ridden to nearby Park Hill that night. They were coming for Boudinot, who'd been staying with his family, his wife Delight and the 6 children, at the Worcester house while he built his own nearby. Arriving just past midnight, the killers watched the Worcester place from the distant trees, waiting for Boudinot to emerge from the front door in the morning. Sure enough, a little after daybreak, out came Boudinot with a few last goodbyes, and then he strode alone across the hayfield to join in with the carpenters at his own house, which was rising a few hundred yards away. As he neared the work site, 3 or 4 Cherokee, all good-sized men, came up to him with worried talk about a sick child. Could he possibly find some medicine? Like Worcester, Boudinot served as a local apothecary, and he kept a few potions at Worcester's mission. He did not know the men, but, in Christian charity, he bade them come along with him to see what he could find. As they made their way back across the field, one of the men dropped slightly behind, and then ripped a bowie knife into Boudinot's back, dropping him head first onto the grass with a cry. Then the Cherokee cracked a tomahawk into the back of Boudinot's skull, and, in a fury, brought it down on him 6 times more. The assailants then rushed off, leaving Boudinot face down, unmoving, his hot blood soaking into the grass, his skull cracked open. Hearing Boudinot's cry, the carpenters rushed to him and raised such a clamor that his wife and Worcester both came tearing from the house. Finding her husband's body, limp, hideously blood-spattered, Delight reached down to cradle him in her arms as she sobbed uncontrollably. "They have cut off my right hand," Worcester cried. By then, a 3rd band had set off to Honey Creek to catch Major Ridge. There were just 6 killers this time. They found out from a neighbor that the major had already left for some business in Van Buren, the whiskey town a good 30 miles south. The men galloped after him, determined to catch their man before he learned about the others. They followed him due east to the Arkansas border, then south down the line road until they found his horse tied to a hitching post. It stood by a farmhouse where the major must have been passing the night. The men waited in the trees until sunup. Then they crept to a window, where they saw the major enjoying some breakfast with his host, unaware of the gathering trouble. The killers galloped on toward Van Buren to lay a trap for him when he came along. They found a spot by a bridge over White Rock Creek, maybe a dozen miles ahead, and there they waited, guns at the ready, in the shadowy underbrush just off the road. It was an hour, perhaps more, before Major Ridge came cantering along. He had a servant following behind. Just as the major reached the bridge, the men burst out at him, guns blasting. Ridge's horse reared up and tossed its rider, who landed hard on the bridge. He was probably already dead from his wounds, but the killers surrounded him all the same and emptied their guns into his quivering body as the servant raced off in a panic to report the terrible news. Guns empty, the men took off, leaving behind them a crumpled, blood-slimed corpse under the oak branches that curved over the bridge. Major Ridge had been right that night at New Echota. He had indeed signed his own death warrant. Each of them had. Stand Wadey was scheduled to die too. He might have been an afterthought compared with the three other, more prominent men of the Ridge family, but he'd signed the New Echota Treaty in Washington without regret, and now he had to pay, just like the others. But a sympathetic Choctaw learned of the murders of the other Ridges and galloped to tell Wadey before killers came for him at the Ridge store at Honey Creek where he was helping out. When the Choctaw arrived, he found several strangers already milling about, appearing to size up the merchandise as they waited, so the Choctaw thought, to catch Wadey alone. The Choctaw took Wadey aside, ostensibly to discuss the price of some sugar, and whispered the dreadful news. Shaken, Wadey immediately slipped out the back and jumped onto the Indian's horse, named Comet for its speed, to get away. But, rather than take refuge, he raced south to warn a sister, who'd moved in near Worcester's place in Park Hill, of the frightening hazards to the family. As he neared her house, he spotted several dozen men on horseback lurking about. He quickly dismounted, slapped his horse to run it off, and, hearing more men coming on horseback up the road, hurried past an orchard to a deep pit the children called the Devil's Sinkhole by the side of the road. Saplings crisscrossed the opening to keep anyone from tumbling in, and Wadey slipped down into a gap between them, grasped one, and then hung off it as the enemy passed by nearly overhead. When all was quiet once more, he pulled himself up and hurried on. More than his brother, and certainly more than the crippled John Ridge or the elderly Major Ridge, Wadey was a man of action. All he lacked was seniority, and that would come quickly, as he was the last of the Ridges, the only one left standing. But he was already a man to reckon with, more than people recognized. They would soon. Glancing about to make sure he was not being watched, Wadey hurried on to his sister, who frantically told him that some men had already come through asking about him. She told him to flee right away. Wadey asked if it was true about their brother, Boudinot. His sister nodded tearfully. His body had been laid out at Worcester's house. Wadey would not leave until he'd seen it. When Wadey arrived at the Worcester house, a gang of armed men milled about outside, but Wadey pushed right through them without stopping, and they didn't dare oppose him in front of everyone. For a crowd had gathered in the little dining room where Boudinot's body was laid out on the table under a white sheet that was smeared with his blood. Everyone went silent on seeing Wadey there, and let him pass, his boots heavy on the wood floor. Reaching the table, Wadey peeled back the shroud and stared down at his dead brother's face. The soulful eyes and warm lips had gone a horrible gray, and the head was hideously askew and misshapen from the axe blows. Wadey stared for a long time in silence, then yanked the shroud back up over his brother again and turned away. Before he reached the door, he shouted to the crowd that he would give $10,000 for the names of his brother's killers. $10,000, he repeated. Then he was gone, the last of the Ridge men. End quote. Just like that, in one day, on June 22, 1839, the Ridge Party leadership was all but erased. Of course, people suspected that John Ross was behind the killings. It's doubtful that he actually ordered them, but it's certain that the killings were done as part of the factional strife that directly resulted from his politics. All the same, Ross was still a savvy politician, and he was ultimately able to spin this to his political advantage. He successfully cast the New Echota Treaty as illegal in the Cherokee public eye, and its signers as outlaws.
He officially pardoned the Ridge's killers and declared that all surviving New Echota signers could be shot on sight without penalty. Not only that, but he was also able to use this to consolidate his own power over the Cherokee government, passing a new constitution which placed himself as principal chief and pushed out the old settler leadership by filling most of the key government offices with Eastern Cherokee Ross Party members. It was quite a political feat, and Sedgwick even calls him a Cherokee Caesar in the middle of all this. But the only real problem from Ross's perspective was that Stand Watie was still alive. Watie had always taken a bit of a back seat to the other three main leaders of the Ridge Party. He was not the patriarch like Major Ridge, and he was not formally educated or a particularly eloquent speaker like John Ridge and Elias Boudinot. Watie had greatness thrust upon him when his brother, cousin, and uncle were all killed in one day. If the assassins had gotten to Watie too, maybe the leaderless remainder of the Ridge Party would have been too cowed by Ross's power and just let him have the government. But Watie was very much alive, and now he was out for blood. The other three assassination targets, John A. Bell, James Starr, and George Adair, had also survived, and Watie gathered them together to carry on. They allied themselves with the old settlers, who were also feeling suppressed and trodden down by Ross's government at this point, and what followed is what I can only describe as a vicious gang war between Watie and the old settlers on one side, and Ross and his allies on the other. I don't know that there's a real official name for this in the historical record, but I'm going to call it the Cherokee Civil War because that's pretty much what it amounts to. Watie directly accused Ross of being behind the assassinations and declared that the old settler government was the only legitimate government in the nation. Ross had a mansion in the settlement of Park Hill near modern-day Tahlequah in eastern Oklahoma, and he was pretty safe there, surrounded by an army of bodyguards. Meanwhile, Watie got in touch with General Matthew Arbuckle at Fort Gibson, who was no fan of Ross as it turned out. Arbuckle had the task of providing protection to the civilized tribes as required by the removal treaties, and as much as he didn't want to get involved in a Cherokee civil war, he seems to have seen Ross as the villain in this situation. As Ross gathered his followers, Watie started to fear that they'd come after him to finish the job, so he took refuge in Fort Gibson. As far as I can tell, this was much more akin to a gang war than anything else. It was even more like that than Bleeding Kansas was. There were no sizable armies marching around. Each party would kill members of the other when opportunity presented itself. Arbuckle started sending out patrols of federal troops to round up the Ridge's assassins, but they were hesitant to actually make any arrests, especially since anyone arrested would be tried in Ross's own courts. Sedgwick writes, quote, "Once he got the names of the suspects, Arbuckle enlisted treaty party men to guide his soldiers to their likely hiding places. The men had all but made themselves scarce, and when they did move about in the open, they traveled in packs, full of scorn for the blue uniforms of Arbuckle's brigades, and the soldiers thought it best to leave them alone, at least for now. Besides, if they risked making an arrest, there was no guarantee that justice would be served in Ross's court. Despite the rising demands from Washington for action against the Ridge's killers, no one was apprehended for the crimes. Ross did nothing to help, and mostly concentrated on keeping himself alive. Protected by a small army at his house, he surrounded himself with 6 well-armed bodyguards whenever he left, the cost billed to the nation. As the summer went on, however, Ross men started turning up dead, victims of summary justice from the other side. The corpses were washed up on the sandy shore of the Arkansas River, or were found lying by the side of a road, the faces bearing a look of surprise. None of the Ridge's main killers was killed in retribution, but a man named Sanders, thought to be involved in Boudinot's murder, died in a brawl, and Edward Gunter, who'd come after Watie, fell to consumption. All the same, more treaty party men were picked off in reprisal. It was the old blood law, one of yours for one of ours." End quote. I wish I could narrate more of this Cherokee Civil War for you, but this is already getting long and this isn't even the main event of this episode, so I'll just be hitting a few highlights. Both Ross and Watie ended up going to Washington and appealing to the federal government for arbitration. As the gang warfare ramped up, Wadey and the Treaty Party became increasingly convinced that this divide was irreconcilable, and they needed to officially separate from the Ross Party and break the Cherokee into two separate nations. Ross didn't want that. He wanted to rule the whole Cherokee Nation, not just half of it. And besides that, he didn't want that $5 million in federal treaty payment to be split in two in such a way that he wouldn't control half of it. The federal government, now headed by President Martin Van Buren, was naturally sympathetic to the Treaty Party, given that they'd been in favor of removal, but as is always the case, the federal government had other fish to fry. Texas had gained its independence from Mexico by this time, and the seeds had been sown for the Mexican-American War that would pop off in a few years. With those concerns, alongside the fact that the still small U.S. Army had just been taxing itself, forcing the Indians to move, there wasn't a lot of energy to spare for getting directly involved in a Cherokee Civil War. Besides his immediate flare of rage following the killings of his family, Stand Wadey seems to have been something of a reluctant leader still. As 1839 and 1840 wore on, it seems like he wasn't too keen to get directly involved in the violence. Late in 1840, a Cherokee named Archilla Smith, one of the signers of the New Echota Treaty, was brought up on murder charges by the Ross government after killing a Ross man, John McIntosh. He claimed self-defense and asked Wadey to represent him in court, which Wadey did, but lost the trial, which was, of course, presided over by Ross Party judges. Archilla Smith was hanged on January 1st, 1841, after a case and trial which were pretty clearly political in nature, which touched off another series of reprisal killings between the two parties. Wadey remained reluctant to get involved, but whether he liked it or not, trouble would find him in the person of James Foreman, a Ross man who'd been one of the ringleaders in the Ridge assassinations. Sedgwick writes that on May 9th, 1842, Wadey left his home at Honey Creek for some business in Van Buren. Quote, as a precaution, he decided to bring along a friend, James P. Miller, for an extra pair of eyes and another gun if need be, while he made his way along the two-track road that wove through the trees. It was late afternoon when they reached the little frontier town of Maysville, just over the Arkansas border, near the turn south onto the Line Road. David England's grocery was the only establishment in town, and the two men were ready to break up the long ride. They tied their horses to the hitching post, pushed open the grocery's swinging door, and entered the cool shadows of the store. Although it was called a grocery, England's shop had a little of everything, from kerosene lamps and tack to barrels of molasses and wheels of cheese, with a jar of peppermint candy on the counter for children, gratis. Wadey and Miller weren't there for any hard goods. They just wanted some restorative whiskey from the bar in the back. In the dim light, Wadey could see that there was a customer already at the bar. He was good-sized, at least 6'4", solid and broad-shouldered. He was well known to Wadey, who may have felt him there before seeing him. It was James Foreman, the leader of the Ross gang that had slaughtered the Three Ridges. Everybody knew that now. A giant in size and strength, someone called him, given to dangerous and deadly stratagems. He was the one who, years back, had clipped John Walker Jr., having teamed up with Anderson Springston, Foreman's half-brother, now dead. Wadey had heard that Foreman was planning to put him out of the way, and that he had lately been careering about the nation with 70 men for the purpose. Only 2 men were with him now, his uncle Alexander Drumgoole and his other half-brother, Isaac Springston. Miller didn't like it. He told Wadey they should probably leave, but Wadey shook him off. He'd come for a drink, and he'd have it. He called out for whiskey, and England set a glass down in front of him and gave it a pour. Before Wadey could have his drink, Foreman swept up Wadey's glass. "Stand Wadey," he said, raising the glass in a mock toast. "Here is wishing that you may live forever." Then he knocked Wadey's drink back and set the empty glass down on the counter. The gesture reeked of insolence, but Wadey maintained an even tone. "Jim, I suppose I can drink with you." He weighed his next words. "But I understand a few days since that you are going to kill me." "Say yourself," Foreman shouted, furious to be called out. Wadey grabbed the glass from Foreman's hand, smashed it down on the bar, and glared at him. Foreman was a head taller than Wadey, and thicker too. Foreman snatched from Drumgoole a thick bullwhip, the kind that can snap a man's neck, stepped back, and brought it whistling down on Wadey's shoulders. But Wadey was well padded by a leather jacket, and, shielding himself with an arm, he dodged away. Foreman was gathering the whip back for another strike when Drumgoole jumped on Wadey's back and tried to put his hands around Wadey's neck. Wadey staggered about the store with Drumgoole heavily on top of him, grasping for his windpipe. Foreman yelled to Springston to fetch his pieces, his guns. As Springston dashed off, Wadey managed to fling Drumgoole out a side door and into the yard, where he lay heaped on the grass. Inside the store, Foreman yanked out a board from England's stack of lumber and was about to crash it down on Wadey's head when Wadey produced a Bowie knife and shoved it into Foreman's chest. At first, Foreman seemed merely surprised to feel the blade inside him. He stepped away from Wadey and out to the yard, and continued to stroll along as if he were in fine health despite the blood spilling down him. After about 20 yards, he wheeled about. "You haven't done it yet," he cried. Then Wadey pulled out his Colt, took aim, and shot Foreman in the chest. Foreman seemed to shrug off the bullet, too, and continued walking as though nothing much had happened. Finally, as he reached a gap in the far fence, his steps slowed and he started to weave. Then he collapsed face first, and he never moved again. Springston came back with a rifle shortly afterward, but it was too late. Seeing what had happened, he didn't dare turn the gun on Wadey. Drumgoole picked himself up and glanced at the dead man off at the far end of the yard. He left Wadey alone, too. End quote. To avoid being tried in Ross's court, Wadey crossed the state line and surrendered himself to Arkansas authorities. Of course, he'd claimed self-defense, but his lawyer, Alfred Arrington, was able to do much more than that, casting the incident as just one piece of the larger Ross versus Ridge conflict. Arrington actually argued that given who James Foreman was as the ringleader behind the Ridge assassinations, and given who Stand Wadey was as a narrowly escaped survivor of those assassinations, and given the current situation in which Wadey was under constant threat of assassins coming after him to finish the job, Wadey ought to have the right of preemptive self-defense against a guy like Foreman. In other words, Wadey would have been completely justified in shooting Foreman on sight, even if Foreman had done nothing whatsoever to provoke him in the moment, is what Arrington argued, at least. It was quite a defense, and the crazy thing is that it worked like a dream, and Wadey was acquitted after just 5 minutes of jury deliberations. Precise numbers are not well known, but it's likely that hundreds of Cherokees died in the low-level guerrilla conflict of this period, from the assassination of the Ridges in 1839 to the signing of a treaty to put an end to the violence in 1846, after the federal government got heavily involved in arbitrating the differences between the two factions. Sedgwick writes, quote, "It proved a remarkable document, in its way more impressive even than the Cherokee Constitution, which had relied so much on the Constitution of the United States. Styled as a treaty, the Treaty of 1846, it had 13 articles covering just about every area of dispute. It called for allowing all fugitives to safely return from Arkansas, or wherever they might be hiding, ending the light horse brigades so hated by the Wadey faction, and dismantling quasi-military organizations like Wadey's troops and Ross's Guard. All party distinctions would cease. Everyone was a Cherokee now. A general amnesty was declared for those accused of committing crimes during the troubled times, so long as they returned to the nation by the end of the year. From now on, however, all laws were to be enforced equally on everyone, guilt to be determined by jury trial. As the original Constitution had declared, everyone in the nation was equally entitled to life, liberty, and property, permitted to assemble peacefully, and allowed to petition the Cherokee government or the federal one for redress of grievances. The old settlers gave up the idea that they alone owned the nation. In return, they were guaranteed a share in the per capita payments that Ross had tried to reserve for late immigrants alone. The treaty party received a special allocation of more than $100,000, of which $5,000 was to be paid to the heirs of the 3 dead Ridges, and the rest would pay the hefty travel expenses of the delegation and settle individual claims of treaty party members regarding their improvements and despoliations in the East. The Cherokee were granted clear, permanent title, not to the nation's land as they all had sought, but only to their individual lots. That was the sole disappointment shared by all. but it was made up for by the U.S. government's promise to restore the payments that had been unfairly deducted from the initial $5 million appropriation for removal, and to pay off all the outstanding per capita money due to the tribe. In the end, the payments were not paid as promptly as promised. The first tranche of money would not be delivered for another 5 years. But the intention proved enough, and all representatives from the three parties agreed to accept the terms. When they had all signed, Wadey and Ross stood up to do something unimaginable. They shook hands in a gesture of good faith." End quote. And that was more or less where things stood in the Cherokee Nation right up through the beginning of the Civil War. The peace held and there was no more violence, but a division as deep and bitter as this one had been wasn't about to just go away overnight. It was right there under the surface, waiting to be revived. Now, another thing that'll play into all this is the influence of the Plains tribes. Because again, there were already Indian tribes living in the Indian Territory before the 5 civilized tribes got there. The Plains tribes generally had had far less contact with white people up to this point. They were less civilized by white American standards, had far less white blood mixed into their populations. They lived nomadic or semi-nomadic lifestyles and had none of the formal government structures that the civilized tribes had picked up from Europeans. On the whole, the Plains tribes would have seen the civilized tribes as not that much different from white settlers when they showed up, even by skin tone in many cases, given how much white ancestry many of the civilized Indians had by the time they moved. The relationship between the two groups in the 1840s and 50s ended up looking a lot like the relationship between the former southeastern tribes and the white Americans in the late 1700s. And under the removal treaties, the U.S. federal government was responsible for providing protection to the civilized tribes in their new homes from possible aggression by the Plains tribes. Mary Jane Ward writes, quote, "The federal government had also promised to protect their new lands, which they would be forced to share with other Indian peoples for the time being. A small corner in the northeastern Indian Territory had been assigned to some Shawnees, as well as the Seneca and Quapaw peoples uprooted from homelands farther east. They tried to live quietly on their own lands. While the federal government had been negotiating with the eastern Indian nations earlier in the removal process, it had also attempted to establish its authority in the region and over the various peoples that already lived, farmed, hunted, and traded there, including the Comanches, Kiowas, Plains Apaches, Wichitas, and Caddos. The government had negotiated a treaty with the Osages by which they ceded their claim to all the lands between the Canadian River and today's Kansas line. Even so, Osages and Pawnees from Nebraska, Kansas, and Missouri still came south to hunt, visit, trade, and raid other tribes' horse herds. Likewise, Kickapoo, Shawnee, Piankashaw, Delaware, Sac, and Fox hunters and traders frequently camped along the cross timbers. The federal government tried through intertribal meetings and negotiations to prevent or suppress conflict among these peoples and with the nations in eastern Indian Territory. It also built a series of military posts along the frontier, beginning in 1824 with Fort Gibson, established near today's Muskogee, Oklahoma, at the Three Forks, the junction of the Arkansas, Verdigris, and Grand Rivers. It remained in service until 1857. Fort Wayne, Fort Coffee, and Fort Towson were also established near the Arkansas border in that early time period. The responsibility of these garrisons was to protect the immigrating Indians, to keep out intruders, those prohibited by law from being in the Indian country, and to stop the illicit liquor trade. All three were abandoned well before 1860 as the U.S. Army built a second line of forts farther west to guard the frontier between the Plains tribes and the newly settled areas. In the Indian Territory, Fort Washita and Fort Arbuckle, part of this new defensive chain, were established on the lower Washita River in the Chickasaw Nation. Still, officials of the 5 civilized tribes often complained of raids by those they called the Wild Indians, intent on stealing horses and cattle from their frontier farms and ranches. In 1859, Fort Cobb was built upstream on the Washita River in the vicinity of today's Anadarko. Its role was to protect Wichita Agency, established in the Least District, as a refuge for about 1,500 Wacos, Tonkawas, Anadarkos, Tawakonis, Ionis, Keechis, Delawares, and Caddos removed from the Brazos Reserve to prevent threatened extermination by the Texans. End quote. Under this protection, the civilized tribes recovered from the horrors of removal and settled into their new lands. Ward writes a little bit later, quote, "By the 1850s, the southeastern Indian nations had entered what historian R.L. Morgan Gibson called the Golden Years. The exception was the Seminole people, whose protracted removal and resettlement period on Muskogee and Cherokee lands before they received their own kept them uncertain and often impoverished into the late 1850s." End quote. Now, as the conflict over slavery really heated up in the U.S. following the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the existing political divisions within the tribes between full-bloods and mixed-bloods, which never quite went away, sort of got co-opted and shunted into the American issue of slavery. Clint Crow has a whole chapter on this in Caught in the Maelstrom, specifically about the two secret societies that sprang up in the few years before the war, the Knights of the Golden Circle and the Kituwa Society. The KGC was not just an Indian secret society, but existed throughout the South, basically to oppose abolitionism. In case you're wondering what Golden Circle refers to, Crow writes, quote, "The quasi-military organization sought to extend and control the production of cotton, tobacco, sugar, rice, and coffee. Members planned to establish a commercial empire based on a slave economy that would encompass a radius of 16 geographical degrees, or about 1,200 miles, a great circle that would include Maryland, Kentucky, southern Missouri, all the states south of them, a portion of Kansas, most of Texas and Old Mexico, all of Central America, the northern part of South America, and all the West Indies. Individual chapters, or lodges, of the KGC were called castles. There were 3 progressive levels of membership. First was the fighting unit, known as the Knights of the Iron Fist. Second was the financial arm, or Knights of the True Faith. Third was the political inner circle, called the Knights of the Columbian Star. KGC castles would form the basis for many early Confederate military units." End quote. The KGC extended naturally into the territory of the civilized tribes. Slavery was as much a fact of life in the tribes as it was in the white American South, and the Indians had brought many of their slaves with them when they moved. In the politics of the Indian Territory, the KGC became aligned with the mixed-blood factions. The KGC was pretty directly tied in with the pro-slavery forces in American politics and pretty clearly existed for that purpose. But its opposite number in the Indian Territory's secret society world seems to have been a little more complicated. Crow continues, quote, "From the mixed bloods' point of view, the Kituwa Society was a political organization of full-bloods created by white abolitionist Baptist missionaries to combat the slave-owning Indians. From the full-blood point of view, the society was the continuation of a pre-Columbian institution dedicated to the preservation of Cherokee culture and religion. On April 15, 1858, members of Peavine Baptist Church gathered to consider how to deal with the mixed bloods. Bud Gritz, a native Baptist preacher and leader of the Kituwas, reported that a small number of leading members of Kituwas got together and discussed the affairs of the Cherokees, the purpose and objectives for which they had always stood. Gritz's report was written a year before the convention at which these men drafted and ratified their plan of action and code of laws. The Kituwa organization predated the Civil War and may have existed in pre-Columbian times. As Nighthawk Kituwa chief Sam Smith testified in 1937, the Kituwas originated thousands of years ago beyond the records and memories of men. Kituwa was a ceremonial name for the Cherokees, representing the traditional culture and values of the Cherokee nation of full-bloods. The word was first recorded by the British in 1730. Kituwu was the town that guarded the northern boundary of the nation. Anthropologist James Mooney recorded that its inhabitants were called Anikituagi, people of Kituwa, and seem to have exercised a controlling influence over those of all the towns on the waters of Tuckasegee and the upper part of the Little Tennessee. The word was synonymous with Cherokee among the Delaware Indians and other Algonquian speakers. The mixed bloods claimed that abolitionist Baptist missionaries Evan Jones and his son John B. Jones were responsible for creating the Kituwa Society. Early Cherokee authorities, including Emmett Starr and James Mooney, stated that one or both of the Joneses organized the society. Indeed, while the Kituwa Society emphasized the preservation of traditional Cherokee culture, the Joneses were influential with most of the membership." End quote. Now, I'm not actually going to talk all that much about these two secret societies, but the reason I bring them up at all, especially the Kituwa Society, is to show you just how muddled all these issues get. The first reason for the existence of the Kituwa Society at this time was to preserve ancient Cherokee full-blood culture. You could almost say it was a reactionary movement against all these changes brought on by contact and intermarriage with whites, and eventually removal. After all, the segment of the population that made up the society was the same one that had opposed removal. In addition to that, it's also true that at some point, the Cherokee anti-removal cause became tied up with the American abolitionist cause. While the Kituwa Society wasn't created to be an abolitionist group, it sort of became one by association, especially association with white abolitionist missionaries like the Joneses, which had been going on for quite a long time, even pre-removal. From Crow again, quote, "The Kituwa Society was not an abolitionist society created by the Joneses, but rather a faction on one side of the cultural rift in the Cherokee Nation. Nevertheless, the Joneses had great influence with the full-bloods. During Evan Jones's early evangelical work in the East, he formed a close political relationship with John Ross by resisting removal. While Ross was in Washington attempting to negotiate new terms for the Cherokees, Jones kept him informed of the morale of the full-bloods and the depredations being inflicted on them. When Elias Boudinot authored a pamphlet defending the New Echota Treaty that was circulated in the United States Congress, Ross chose Jones to write the rebuttal. The degree to which Ross and Jones cooperated to resist removal is illustrated in the postscript and a letter from Jones to Ross. Will another protest from the people be of any avail? If so, let me know the principal points to be dwelt on, and in the kind of style or tone, rather, whether confident or submissive, or both mixed." As slavery became the dominant issue in the South, the Southern Protestant churches endorsed the institution and gradually silenced Southern moderates opposed to slavery. Jones was unique as an anti-slavery Baptist, sponsored by the Baptist Home Mission Board, who came west with the Cherokees and their slaves and continued to work among them until the beginning of the Civil War. End quote. To add one more complication to all this, consider that John Ross, the chief opponent of removal and representative of the full-bloods, despite the fact that he was almost all Scottish by ancestry, was now loosely tied in to a full-blood secret society which was vaguely abolitionist, despite the fact that he owned 20-odd slaves himself. And besides that, he was about as far from a Cherokee traditionalist as you could possibly get. Not only was he not a full-blood, but he was also a key figure in bringing about much of the modernization of the Cherokee government. I don't even want to try to list all the contradictions in there. There's just too many of them. To finish up with Clint Crow again, quote, "Ross, the Joneses, and the Kituwas each opposed the mixed-blood faction for different reasons. The Joneses opposed the mixed-bloods over slavery, while the Kituwas' opposition was an effort to preserve Cherokee culture. His political strength came from the full-bloods, and he opposed the mixed-bloods in order to maintain his position as chief of the Cherokees. The Civil War drove a wedge into this highly complex division within the Cherokee Nation. The Knights of the Golden Circle, representing the Wadey faction, helped organize the pro-Confederate mixed-blood Cherokees against Ross and his full-blood political base. The Kituwa Society sought to preserve the old Cherokee traditions and social structure while incorporating Northern Baptist Christian theology. The society helped to organize its members against the mixed-bloods who had drifted away from traditional Cherokee society and aligned with the Confederacy. The full-bloods were pro-Union and anti-Confederate from the beginning of the conflict, but the convoluted policies of Chief Ross made it difficult initially for them to express their loyalties openly. Ross stubbornly sought neutrality to avoid involvement in the war. Pressure from the pro-South Cherokees, the strategic location of the Five Nations, the absence of federal authority, aggressive Southern diplomacy, and the Confederate early war victory on August 10, 1861 at Wilson's Creek in southwestern Missouri, however, forced him to make a choice." End quote. Now, there were quite a few reasons why the civilized tribes would be natural allies to the Confederacy. First is their cultural kinship to the southern states and their geographic position right next to Texas and Arkansas. They also had slavery, but that seems kind of secondary given that the official Union war aims early in the war had nothing to do with abolition. To make the case even stronger for the Confederacy, refer back to that line about absence of federal authority in that quote I just read. Remember, the federal government had established a chain of army forts in the Indian Territory for the express purpose of maintaining its authority in the region and providing protection for the civilized tribes as required by their treaties. So what's going on here? Well, the simple fact is that the feds mostly abandoned those forts on the outbreak of civil war. The war obviously saddled the North with an immediate high demand for army manpower, and the forts in the Indian Territory just weren't that high of a priority. Treaties with the Indians be damned. And even if the Union had tried to maintain a presence in some or all of these forts, they likely would have just fallen anyway, given that potential Confederate attackers from the states of Texas and Arkansas were right next door, while in order to supply and reinforce the forts, the Union would have to go through the tumultuous Missouri, the still primitive state of Kansas, and the roiling mass of chaos that was the border between them. Besides abandoning the forts and leaving them at the mercy of raids by the Plains tribes, the federal government had also never been very good about actually making the annuity payments due to the civilized tribes, also as required by their treaties. The Confederacy understood those factors very well and were quick to capitalize by establishing their own diplomatic presence in the Indian Territory. Crow writes, quote, "The withdrawal of the federal troops removed the last vestige of Union authority in the Indian nations. All remaining Indian agents were Southern secessionists. The Indians opposed to severing ties with the federal government were placed at a disadvantage, while those in favor of allying with the secession movement gained momentum amid the spreading Southern fervor for disunion." End quote. The man Jefferson Davis chose to be his diplomatic point of contact with the Indian Territory was named Albert Pike, and although I'm not going to go into a ton of detail on him, he was quite a character of his own. He was a Bostonian by birth, but had spent a lot of time as a young man among the Creeks and Choctaws and made friends there. He became a lawyer and really made his name as a friend of the Indians when he won an $800,000 settlement for the Choctaws and Chickasaws related to land payments. In the months following the secessions and the firing on Fort Sumter, Pike was able to negotiate treaties of alliance with at least parts of all 5 civilized tribes, but there were a couple of all-important holdouts. The first was, of course, John Ross, who was still principal chief of the Cherokee in 1861. As a representative of the full-bloods, he favored the Union, and as the summer of 1861 wore on, his government refused to make any alliance with the Confederacy. Stand Watie, on the other hand, was much more receptive to Confederate diplomatic advances, and although he held no official government position in the Cherokee Nation anymore, he was still a prominent man and had never stopped being a leader among the mixed bloods. He had a working relationship and informal agreements with Pike well before the Ross government did anything official to ally itself with the Confederacy. The other holdout was one 83-year-old chief of the Upper Creeks, Opothle Yahola. I mentioned his name a while back, and this is why. Veteran of the losing side of the Red Stick Rebellion all the way back in 1813, fierce opponent of removal and prominent leader of the full-blood Muskogees, he held no official government post anymore, but was still looked to as a revered leader and elder among his tribe, and he'd be one of the last men to ever ally himself with the Confederacy. Meanwhile, Daniel McIntosh had been just 3 years old in 1825 when his father was assassinated by Opothle Yahola's faction back in Georgia, but now he was all grown up, and along with his older brother, Chili McIntosh, was a prominent leader among the Lower Creeks, who were quick to sign a treaty of alliance with Pike. I haven't gone into a ton of detail on the history of the Creeks in this episode, but they and their internal political divisions are about to make an appearance again in a big way. Now, of these 2 holdouts, Ross seems to have been something of a political pragmatist. The only real pragmatic reason not to ally with the Confederacy at this point was that it was highly questionable whether they could actually win this war. Ross didn't want to put himself in a position where he was allied with the losing side in a war that only lasted a few months. That could put the Cherokees standing with the U.S. federal government in jeopardy in the event that the war went south in a hurry for the Confederacy. Politically, it was much safer for him to advocate neutrality and try to maintain it until this whole thing blew over. But that all changed when the 1-2 punch of First Bull Run and Wilson's Creek came in July and August. Now it looked like the Confederacy was actually winning, and immediately it became that much harder for Ross to justify not signing a treaty with them. It took him almost 2 more months after Wilson's Creek, but in early October, he finally signed, and officially allied the Cherokee Nation with the Confederacy. If Ross was a political pragmatist, the other holdout was absolutely not. Opothleyaholo was something else completely. This is how Jay Monahan introduces him in Civil War on the Western Border. Quote, "The 80-year-old chief was a blanket Indian. He painted his face and could neither read nor write, but his brain was powerful. He owned many slaves and cultivated 2,000 acres of land, keeping all the details of his business, various mortgages and payments, and the income and expenses of the Creek Nation in his mind." End quote. Like Major Ridge, he was from an earlier generation of Indian, and although he was a full-blood while Ridge was a mixed blood, and although they came down on opposite sides of the removal issue, I have a feeling that these two might have understood each other pretty well. Opothleyahola's loyalty to the Union had nothing to do with political pragmatism, and much more to do with an older form of politics. A form of politics which was less about formalized institutions negotiating with each other through human representatives, and more about personal relationships between individual leaders. Ward writes, quote, "His antipathy to the McIntoshes aside, Opothleyaholo intended to remain neutral for 2 reasons, according to some accounts. First, he had given his allegiance to the United States in 1814 after the Red Stick defeat at Horseshoe Bend, Alabama, and he would not break his word. Second, he was trying to communicate directly with President Abraham Lincoln. On August 15th, the old speaker and Sands, another full-blood chief, sent a letter to the president, reminding the Indians' symbolic Great Father that when they were removed to the Indian Territory, quoting the letter now, "You said that in our new homes we should be defended from all interference, and that no white people should ever molest us, but the land should be ours as long as grass grew or waters run, and should we be injured by anybody, you would come with your soldiers and punish them. But now the wolf has come. Men who are strangers tread our soil, and children are frightened, and the mothers cannot sleep for fear." Back to Ward. Sands and Opothleyaholo, who had headed the 1832 delegation to Washington, D.C. to negotiate the Muskogee Removal Treaty, reminded Lincoln, quoting the letter again, "I was at Washington when you treated with us, and now white people are trying to take our people away to fight against us and you. I am alive. I well remember the treaty. My ears are open, and my memory is good." And back to Ward. In this letter, Opothleyaholo and Sands were addressing current concerns among their people. Confederate agitators were circulating among the Indian Territory tribes, warning that the federal government meant to dispossess them again and claiming the Confederacy was their only friend. What the Muskogees and other tribes needed from the federal government right then, and what Opothleyaholo and Sands were asking for, was protection from those intruders and reassurance their people would not be driven out of their homes again. End quote. And then a little later on, Ward continues, quote, "Lincoln's reply was simply that the conflict between the federal government and the Confederacy did not concern the Indians or their interests, and that they should remain neutral. What it did not do was offer the reassurance they needed, nor did it promise them help, a federal agent to serve as their liaison with the government, or troops for protection. The loyal Muskogees and like-minded members of other tribes were on their own." End quote. John Ross's defection to the Confederacy amounted to a betrayal as far as Opothleyaholo was concerned. The old chief was not about to betray the U.S. government, even if they'd betrayed him and hung him out to dry. And since he wasn't going to be getting any foreseeable help, he took matters into his own hands. He gathered around him a core of full-blood Upper Creek followers who wanted nothing to do with supporting the Confederacy, and before he knew it, members of other tribes were flocking to his banner. The situation called for safety in numbers for anyone who wanted no part of the American war, and full-blood members of the Seminole, Cherokee, and to a lesser extent Choctaw and Chickasaw nations joined his camp. They were joined by members of some of the smaller tribes like the Delaware, Shawnee, and Quapaw, as well as some runaway slaves looking for protection from the Confederate allied tribal governments. By early November, Opothleyaholo had some 7,000 to 8,000 assorted Indians and runaway slaves camped on his own land on the Deep Fork River near modern-day Okmulgee, Oklahoma. And that sets the stage for the main event of this episode, the thing I've been building up to this whole time. It's only taken us 3 hours to get here. Well, that many people gathered together in one place was starting to look like an army. And for the Indian Territory, it was a pretty sizable one. This far out west, you'll rarely see armies of more than a couple thousand, and this one was large enough to attract the attention and concern of the Confederate allies in the region. Except that Opothleyaholo's army was not really an army, at least not most of it. Out of the 8,000 or so people in his band, only about 1,500 were actually warriors. The rest were women, children, the sick or elderly, and various other non-combatants, all of whom now looked to him for leadership and protection. Before long, he realized he'd have to move to find better grazing for the massive herds of cattle and horses that accompanied the people. His route throughout the campaign that followed is not well documented. There's plenty of dispute over exactly where he went and when, and the few books I've read on this say different things at points, but it's clear enough what happened in the broad strokes. For example, Jay Monahan says that he left home and moved west out onto the open prairie, while Clint Crow says that he moved east initially, but put out word that he was moving west to throw off Confederate allied Indians who might come after him. Either way, he eventually did move west, fleeing the first aggressive action of Confederate forces against him. The Confederate allied Indians hadn't been idle while Opothleyaholo was gathering followers, and the McIntoshes in particular were out for blood. Monahan writes, quote, Chili and Daniel had persuaded the Creek Council to treat with Albert Pike, and Chili had joined the escort which went west with the commissioner to help convert the wild Indians. Daniel, at home, had enlisted a Creek regiment, and, proclaiming the hatchet dug up, hoisted a Confederate flag over the Creek agency. Opothleyaholo fled to his plantation, fearing the McIntoshes' revenge, as much as Chief Ross feared Stand Wady's. All Creeks loyal to the Union joined his encampment. End quote. Then a little later he continues, quote, To stop the exodus, the McIntoshes called for help from the brigade of Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Texans, which liquor-loving Douglas Cooper had raised at his agency. Long-haired and goateed Daniel N. McIntosh hastened enlistments in his All Creek regiment by promising that captured cattle and Negroes, free or slave, belonging to Opothleyaholo's supporters would be sold, and the money used to start a new Creek treasury. The entire Confederate force, red and white, numbered at least 1,400. With high confidence, they jogged away to catch Opothleyaholo, then march on to Kansas. At the column's head rode Cooper's 4th Texas Cavalry. Next came the Creek Regiment, commanded by Colonel D. N. McIntosh. Behind his regiment straggled the Creek and Seminole Battalion under John Jumper and Chili McIntosh, the latter, in his buggy, whetting toothless gums in anticipation of revenge for the assassination of his father. The giant Major Jumper, astride a suitable charger, appeared as dignified and benign as though leading his congregation to church. In the rear came Colonel Cooper himself, with his Choctaw Chickasaw regiment. End quote. Now again, the accounts of Opothleyaholo's actions are pretty unclear, but from what I can tell, after an initial move to the northwest, he split his followers, sending the non-combatants doubling back to the northeast across the Arkansas River, while he continued with his warriors to the west along the Cimarron River. By the way, this is right in my neighborhood today. I live right along the Cimarron River, right in the backyard of this campaign. Opothleyaholo could move faster without the non-combatants and herds, so he seems to have been pretty successful in leading the Confederates on a wild goose chase for a while. Crow picks up the story from here. Quote, The Confederates crossed the Cimarron River on November 19th. Texas scouts reported smoke 5 miles ahead. The Texas cavalry investigated, but found only an abandoned camp. Near sundown, a man on horseback enticed about 150 Texans to follow him. The riders soon came under fire from warriors hidden in the timber along Salt Creek, a few miles west of modern Yale, Oklahoma. The Texans formed a rough battle line and fired 3 volleys, but the Loyalists had set the prairie on fire and soon outflanked them. The rebels retreated 300 yards, attempted a stand, failed, and continued retreating another 2 miles as night fell. When Cooper learned of their plight, he advanced with his troops. Arriving on the scene, he ordered his men to dismount and moved ahead of them in the darkness. Calling out to see if there were any Texans ahead, Cooper received a volley from the loyal Indians in response. The skirmishing soon ended, and in the morning Cooper's men found only 12 discarded wagons, scattered ponies, and some cattle. Opothleyahola's warriors had gone north to the Arkansas River, crossed, and returned to their families. Concurrently, Brigadier General McCulloch ordered Cooper to move close to the Arkansas border. McCulloch was concerned about a possible Union campaign out of Springfield under General John C. Fremont. McCulloch intended to meet it, but thought he might be forced to move south into the Boston Mountains. Opothlayahola was in communication with sympathetic Cherokee Kituwas and Colonel John Drew's Confederate Cherokee Regiment. They put no faith in the alliance with the rebels and planned to unite with Opothlayahola and await the invasion of the Federal Army. Abolitionist missionary Evan Jones was incredulous when he heard that Ross had sided with the Confederacy and refused to believe it was voluntary. Writing to Commissioner of Indian Affairs William Dole just 19 days before the Battle of Round Mountain, Jones expressed his frustration at being unable to get a message from Kansas to Ross. He had spoken to the delegation from Opothlayahola and told the commissioner that one among them had said the full-blood Creeks, Seminoles, and Cherokees were loyal. Jones thought Ross's actions must have been forced and would only be temporary. I was perfectly astounded at the announcement of the defection of John Ross and the Cherokees. I have no doubt the unfortunate affair was brought about under stress, explained Jones, and that it only needs a sufficient force to afford them protection to secure a speedy and cordial return to their former alliance. Many of these Cherokees apparently felt that Opothleyahola's rebellion provided adequate protection. They did not wait for Ross to act. Rather, under the guidance and organization of the Kituwa Society, they aligned with Opothleyahola's movement. 19th century anthropologist James Mooney believed that the Kituwa Society was active in both the Creek and Cherokee nations. If Opothleyahola's traditional full-bloods were not members of the society, they shared the same reservations about allying with the Confederacy and were in communication with the Kituwa organization. On the day before the fighting at Round Mountain, Confederate allied Creek chiefs Modi Kennard and Echo Harjo went into Opothleyahola's camp, where the loyal Creeks told him they were expecting help from the Cherokees. After the battle, Kennard and Harjo passed this information on to Ross. Opothlayahola and the Creek and Seminole chiefs had demonstrated great facility in controlling events and manipulating Cooper, and their plan was still unfolding. End quote. Well, if you remember the last episode, you might remember that John C. Fremont was relieved and replaced with Henry Halleck shortly after arriving in Springfield, so his campaign that McCulloch was concerned about never materialized. The Battle of Round Mountain was really more of a skirmish and was inconclusive at best, but given that the loyal Creeks threw off the pursuit in the end and the first Confederate attempt to put down Opothleyahola's movement ended in failure, it was close enough to a victory to swell his numbers a bit. Now is a good time to explain what was going on with the Cherokee. As you just heard from that quote, a Cherokee regiment under Colonel John Drew was enlisted with the Confederates. There was another Cherokee regiment in the process of being formed under, you guessed it, Colonel Stand Watie. And given the way the Cherokee story has played out up to now, it should come as no surprise that one Cherokee regiment, Drew's, was made up of full-blood Ross Party men, and the other, Watie's, was made up of mixed-blood Ridge Party men. And it seems that even though Ross had allied the tribe officially with the Confederacy, already Kituwa Society members were at work within Drew's regiment. This will become important very soon. Douglas Cooper wouldn't have to wait long to get another crack at Opothlayahola, and in early December, once it was clear there would be no Union attack out of Springfield, he set out again with a force more than 1,500 strong. Crow continues, quote, arriving at Tulsytown, Cooper learned that Opothlayahola had moved to Chusto Talasa, Bird Creek, north of modern Tulsa, near Captain James McDaniel's home. The non-combatants probably remained encamped on Hominy Creek, which flows into Bird Creek. McDaniel, formerly a senator of the Cherokee National Committee, was captain of the 1st Reserve Company of Drew's regiment. His officers' names demonstrate the ethnicity of his regiment. His first lieutenant was Wat Stop, and his second lieutenants were Noah Drowning Bear and Big Sky Yak Toucan. John Drew was stationed at Cootie's Bluff on the Verdigris River. Cooper reported that Drew was to meet with him somewhere on the road to James McDaniels. From some misunderstanding, Colonel Drew marched direct to Melton's, 6 miles from Apopleahola. Thus he arrived in the immediate vicinity of the enemy 24 hours or more in advance of the main body. Drew's movements may have been influenced by the actions of his disloyal officers, for a mass defection occurred during the early evening of December 8, 1861, the day before the Battle of Chusto-Thalassa. On the afternoon of December 8th, Cooper gave Drew permission to send a peace delegation to treat with Apopleahola, who had made a peace overture to gain time and perhaps facilitate the defection. Most of Drew's men who left did not return to the Confederate ranks. By late evening, Drew realized that only 60 of 480 men remained in the camp. Major Pegg, a Ross loyalist and member of the peace delegation, returned from Apopleahola's camp and reported that Drew's position would be attacked. The remnants of Drew's regiment left their equipment behind and moved with speed to Cooper's camp 2 miles below on Bird Creek. Expecting action, the men remained alert all night, but no attack occurred. Early the next morning, the remaining Cherokees, with help from some Choctaws and Texans, retrieved their valuable equipment that had been left untouched by the enemy. Drew reported in detail the names of the officers who joined Apopleahola. These officers and their men did not desert because of a lack of courage. They merely abandoned a confederacy that had never commanded their loyalty. Given the apparent organization of the defection and the irregular movement of Drew's regiment the day before, it seems probable that the action had been planned. The conspiracy may have begun weeks before if the communication between Apopleahola and the Kituas included the Creek chiefs' plans to move east of the Arkansas River. During the morning of December 9th, Cooper sent 2 Creek companies under Captain Foster to scout Apopleahola's position. At 11 a.m., Cooper crossed to the east side of Bird Creek and moved south across the adjacent prairie. After he covered about 5 miles, Captain Foster's runners arrived to report to Cooper that the advanced scouting party was under fire and retreating. Simultaneously, Cooper's force also came under attack. The loyal Indians retreated to a large horseshoe bend in the creek where the men prepared to give battle. Heavy timber sheltered the creek bottom. Apopleahola's men also occupied a hidden ravine extending from the creek into the prairie. The Battle of Chusto-Thalassa was about to begin. Chusto-Thalassa, or Caving Banks, was an apt description of Bird Creek, a strong flowing stream with steep banks that dropped 20 feet to the current below. To the west of the creek was picturesque, forested hill country and Apopleahola's base camp. Only his men knew where the fording points they would use during the battle were located. As the attacking Confederates later acknowledged, it was a well-chosen defensive position. Cooper placed the Cherokee train under a strong guard on the prairie and positioned his forces with the Creeks on his left flank. The remaining Cherokees and the Texans occupied his center, and the Choctaws and Chickasaws were on the north, or right flank. When all was ready, the Confederate forces attacked the fortified position from the east. Colonel William B. Sims divided his 9th Texas Cavalry early in the action in order to serve with the Choctaws and Chickasaws when he became aware of the heavily defended ravine farther to the north. The rebel Creeks attacked along the bend where a house with a corn crib and rail fence marked the center of the battle. Most of the fighting took place dismounted. Both sides alternately gained and lost the advantage, but the Confederate force, in occasionally sharp fighting that lasted as much as 4 hours, failed to achieve a decisive victory. The battle ended with nightfall when the loyal Indians were driven or withdrew across Bird Creek. The Confederates returned to their camp. Cooper's command held the field, but had lost 15 to 30 killed, some 37 wounded, and suffered several hundred desertions. Apopleahola's command, perhaps 500 in all, lost about 9 killed. End quote. Well, that was not good news for the Confederate Indians. Not only had Cooper's second attempt to take Apopleahola failed, but now even more full-bloods from tribes ostensibly allied to the Confederacy were defecting to his side. But the old chief was starting to realize something too, which was that help from the North was most likely never coming. It seems that up to now he'd been content to hover around the Creek and Cherokee sections of the Indian Territory, evading or repulsing the Confederates when necessary and appealing to the Union Army up in Kansas to come to his aid. But they weren't, and now he decided it was time to go to them instead. And it would have to be fast, because his success and growing popularity was starting to work to his detriment instead of his advantage. Confederate newspapers had picked up his story, greatly exaggerating the size of his force and the magnitude of the threat he posed, as newspapers are wont to do, to the point where the Confederate brass in the region were willing to devote more force to putting an end to this. On top of that, Stand Waty's regiment was now formed, and you can bet they were itching for a crack at the Ross men who'd defected. I'll read from Monahan on the next major development of the campaign. Quote, Colonel Cooper spurred ahead of his men to confer with Chief Ross and General McCulloch. He wanted an explanation for the desertion of the 500 Cherokee, and he also wanted some white soldiers to stiffen his Indian brigade. To his disappointment, Chief Ross equivocated, and McCulloch was absent in Richmond, Virginia, conferring with President Jeff Davis about his conflicting authority with Sterling Price. The command had devolved on James McIntosh, no relation to the Creek, and this proved good for Cooper. McIntosh was always less cautious than his chief. He agreed to come to Cooper's aid with 1,380 Wilson's Creek veterans, catch a Pothlayahola, or pull a wheel off. Again, the plan was to strike the Union Indians front and rear, the Indian Brigade to march up the Arkansas, the Americans up the Verdigris. McIntosh led the way. The weather turned cold with snow hissing through the gloomy Blue Hills. At noon on December 26, 1861, a company of his Texans probed the thin ice for a ford across Shoal Creek, a tributary of the Verdigris. Distant rifle shots peppered the slope behind them. The lead squad splashed across and hid behind the bank on the enemy's side. McIntosh halted his main army out of range and studied the country ahead. Beyond his crouching men, a prairie stretched 400 yards to a ridge dotted with boulders and blackjacks, which undoubtedly sheltered the enemy. The Wilson's Creek veterans prided themselves on being able cavalrymen, but a successful charge could hardly start along a frozen creek and end at an impassable hillside. McIntosh turned to his shivering men. He ordered them to dismount and warm themselves by deploying rapidly in line. Then he shouted to the company behind the creek bank to open fire by squads, spatter the hillside with lead until no Indian dared raise his head. Next, he turned to his bugler. Blow the charge. End quote. The Battle of Chustinala was a rearguard action on a Pothleyahola's part. The Confederate force coming after him had more than doubled in size since the last time they'd fought, and they didn't have the disadvantage of having 3 to 4 times their own number of non-combatants to protect. Even so, the loyal Creek warriors prepared to at least buy time for their non-combatants to get away. From Ward, quote, At the top of the hill, a rock ledge made a natural breastwork, which the Indians used as a shield. At first, the Confederates could only get around the ends of it, but the fighting was hand-to-hand as the 3rd Texas Cavalrymen led the scramble over the top. The 2nd Arkansas pushed into a thicket to drive out Indians that had taken cover there, while the 6th Texas Cavalry succeeded in flanking them on the right. With their ammunition running out, the fugitive Indians soon began breaking off from the fight and hurrying away. Some refused to run, though. One of the 3rd Texas Cavalrymen remembered, Some of those Indians were very brave and daring and would not leave. One big feathered cap fellow stood out from the trees and continued shooting until he fell. I had shot both barrels of my gun and one of my holster pistols at him before he fell. Others ran toward their camps and regrouped there. According to Muskogee oral history, Conchate Amafla and 25 men of the Muskogee-Wawaka town made a stand near Opothleyahola's camp. They fought off Colonel Young's Texans until they ran out of ammunition. Then they reversed their rifles and fought on, using them as clubs, until only one man was left on his feet. He killed Lieutenant McQuirk, grabbed the bridle of his horse, and sprang into the saddle. Luckily, there was a pair of pistols with the saddle, and this man used them to fight his way out and escape. Other loyal Indians fled in ones, twos, and small groups. The enemy by this time were much scattered and had retreated to the rocky gorges amid the deep recesses of the mountain, McIntosh reported, where they were pursued by our victorious troops and routed in every instance with great loss. Later, Captain John J. Good of Dallas mused to his wife, "How blunted are our sensibilities amid the perils of war. Men ride over the battlefield and laugh at what would once shock them." Another man said later, "I took the scalp of 2 Indians that day. That was all I had time to fool with." By 4 o'clock, the battle was over, and McIntosh and his troops occupied Apothle-Ahola's camp. Unlike the battle at Chusto Talasa, this time they had struck a devastating blow to the fugitive column. We captured 160 women and children, 20 Negroes, 30 wagons, 70 yoke of oxen, about 500 Indian horses, several hundred head of cattle, 100 sheep, and a great quantity of property of much value to the enemy, McIntosh wrote. The stronghold of Apothle-Ahola was completely broken up, and his force scattered in every direction, destitute of the simplest elements of subsistence. End quote. The Loyal Creek warriors fought a valiant rearguard action, but in the end, the dam broke, and the camp of some 5,000 non-combatants was broken up and scattered to the wind. Stand Waty's regiment had arrived too late to participate in the battle, but first thing in the morning, they, along with the rest of the Confederate Indians, struck out north in a merciless pursuit of the fugitives. In a war like this, with 40 years of pent-up bitterness, factional strife, and intra-tribal civil war behind them, ruthlessness was to be expected. As the surviving members of Apothle-Ahola's band fled for their lives to the north across the frozen prairie, they gave this campaign its name in the history books: the Trail of Blood on Ice. Forced to flee without their supply train, with only what they could carry on their person, they were grossly undersupplied and unprepared for such a trip. In blizzard conditions, cold enough to make well-clothed cavalrymen get off their horses and walk to keep their blood flowing, these Indians were not well-clothed. Ward writes in When the Wolf Came, quote, "Phoebe McIntosh Banks, too small to remember, described what her elders saw." Quoting Banks now. "Dead all over the hills when we get away. Some of the Negroes shot and wounded so bad the blood run down the saddle skirts, and some fall off their horses miles from the battleground and lay still on the ground. Daddy and Uncle Jacob keep our family together somehow and head across the line into Kansas." Back to Ward. Panicked people scattered in all directions, trying to escape the Confederate allies. James Scott, a boy of 9 or 10, could not forget one image even in his old age. One time we saw a little baby sitting on its little blanket in the rocks. Everyone was running because an attack was expected, but no one had the time to stop and pick up the child, James said. As it saw the people running by, the little child began to wave its little hands. The child had no knowledge that he had been deserted, James concluded sadly. Private James H. Curley remembered that his fellow soldiers in the 6th Texas Cavalry captured a number of women and children, along with fine beef cattle and camp equipment. They turned the women and children over to Colonel Cooper. The next day they came across an old woman lying on a buffalo robe. Curley said, "She was so old she looked like a pile of wrinkles. We tried to feed her, but she shut her eyes and would not look at us." It was not only the soldiers the fugitives feared. The weather was worsening. There had been sleet during the night, and they had lost what they needed to survive a winter journey of about 100 miles. Their routes towards safety in Kansas are still disputed. Some may have taken the Osage Trail northwestward along Bird Creek, or gone even farther west to follow the Arkansas River or Black Beaver's Road. Still others could have gone eastward to intercept the Osage Trails north along the Caney or Verdigris rivers. Whatever their route, oral history depicted a common experience. James Scott summarized, quoting Scott now, "We faced many hardships. We were often without food. The children cried from weariness and the cold. We fled and left our wagons with much-needed provisions, clothing, and other necessities. Many of our friends and loved ones perished from sickness, and we all suffered from the cold, as it was during the winter that we were on our flight to a neutral country. When our provisions went low, some of the members of the tribe turned to eating horse flesh." Back to Ward. Making matters worse, a ferocious winter storm blew in across the plains, bringing harsh winds, frigid temperatures, and snow. Some fugitives had been captured and sent back to their home countries. The others, many now barefoot, trudged on toward the Kansas line, hoping to find protection, shelter, and relief. Some froze to death on the way. Their bodies, left where they fell by people who lacked the means, energy, and time to bury them, fed hungry wolves." End quote. And Sedgwick writes in Blood Moon, quote, "They fled through heavy snow and bitter winds clear to Kansas, many of them dying of starvation even before the bitter cold could get to them. Terrified mothers killed their babies so the enemy could not grab them. Some refugees ate their horses and hid inside the carcasses. The Creek survivors who straggled into the Kansas campsites of the Union Army must have made a grim sight. Half dead from exhaustion, disease, and hunger, the survivors were met by Union surgeons with hacksaws, eager to cut off any limbs lost to frostbite. Hundreds died. All the corpses were dropped into mass graves that scarcely dipped into the frozen ground." End quote. The ordeal wasn't even over once the survivors made it to the Union Army in Kansas, because blankets, food, shelter, and other necessities for several thousand extra people were slow in coming. Clint Crow writes in Caught in the Maelstrom that something like 1/10 of the entire Creek population was dead by the end of the following summer. Just like that. As much as the Muskogee and their allies had suffered during this desperate flight north, and as much as the Cherokee had been through in the decades leading up to this, it was all just a foretaste of things to come. The Cherokee Civil War of the 1840s was flaring up in earnest again along the same factional lines as before, and the larger American Civil War was dumping a giant can of gasoline on that fire. What that would mean for all 5 civilized tribes, as well as many of the Plains tribes, was devastation on a scale they hadn't seen since at least before the Creek War, and maybe had never seen before at all. Today, civilization has come to the prairies of Kansas and Oklahoma. The land is divvied up into parcels and fenced off. There are modern towns and cities, even a few big ones. Interstate highways and power lines crisscross the landscape. But America is a land haunted by the ghosts of its wilder past. And if you take a drive out to a quiet spot on the prairie, away from the cities and towns and interstates, especially on a windy or a stormy night, you might still hear them.
And am I born to die, to lay this body down and into a world unknown. Soon as from earth I go, what will become of me? Eternal happiness or woe must then my portion be. A land of deepest shade, unpierced by human thought, that dreary region of the dead, where all things are forgot. And am I born to die, to lay this body down, and must my traveling spirit fly into a world unknown?
On the next episode of American Guerrillas, we'll get back to the main story of the Kansas-Missouri border war. I'll tie in this episode and justify why I spent so much time on such a tangent, and the war will heat up as we move on into 1862. It'll get a lot worse before it gets better. In the meantime, check out the Substack if you haven't already. It's called The Unsung Substack. There's a link in the show notes. Support me there for $5 a month or $50 a year if you want, or make a one-time donation to PayPal or Venmo in any amount you choose to contribute to my book fund. I really do appreciate everyone who has already donated or will donate in the future. I really do enjoy doing this, and the fact that I can make a few bucks to help offset the cost of books is a nice bonus. One final thing. In the week before I'm releasing this, out of nowhere, just briefly, for one day, the Unsung Substack jumped up to number 43 in Substack's top 100 Rising in History list. So that's pretty cool, for whatever that's worth. It was a little random since I hadn't released an episode in almost 3 months at that point, but pretty cool nonetheless, and I just have to say thanks for listening to whoever contributed to that algorithm voodoo magic. So thank you again for listening. If you did start with this episode as a standalone, please go back and listen to the rest of the series in order. It's really good. And I hope you'll join me again for the next one. That the deeds of men shall not go unsung.